My doctor husband divorced me after listening to his mother. She is a soldier. Women like her do not have babies, my mother-in-law Vivian said. 7 months later, I went into premature labor during his shift. The moment he saw my daughter, he turned pale. Is she mine? He screamed. What he did not know was that the baby's rare genetic trait was about to expose a massive fraud. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled their elite empire piece by piece. My name is Aliyah. I am 32 years old, a former logistics and intelligence officer for the United States Army, and currently the chief executive officer of a federal cybersecurity firm. Of course, my ex-husband's family thought I was just a low-level government contractor. The sharp, agonizing cramp hit me the moment I stepped off the plane at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. I gripped the handle of my carry-on bag, my knuckles turning white as a second wave of pain ripped through my lower abdomen. I was exactly 28 weeks pregnant. This was not supposed to happen for another 2 months. I had just returned from a covert data auditing trip in Washington, an assignment I took to keep my mind off the brutal divorce I had endured 7 months prior. I leaned against a cold concrete pillar near baggage claim, breathing through the pain, using the tactical breathing techniques I learned in basic training. A warm rush of fluid soaked through my trousers. My water had broken. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford in a combat zone, and you certainly cannot afford it when your unborn child is in danger. I needed an emergency contact. I needed someone to get me to a hospital immediately. Living in Atlanta meant I was completely isolated from my own extended family who were scattered across the country. In a moment of pure desperation and agonizing physical pain, I pulled out my phone and opened the group chat that I had not yet deleted. It was the group chat containing my ex-husband Julian, his mother Vivian, and his sister Jasmine. My fingers trembled violently as I typed a hasty message. My water just broke at the airport. I am only 7 months along. I need a ride to Atlanta Memorial Hospital immediately. Please help me. I watched the read receipts appear. Someone was typing. I leaned heavily against the wall, hoping that despite the bitter divorce, basic human decency would prevail. Julian was a neonatal pediatrician, for heaven's sake. He took an oath to save premature lives. The phone buzzed in my palm. The reply was from Jasmine. We are in the middle of a private wine tasting event in Buckhead. Try calling an Uber. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring from another intense rolling contraction. Before I could even process the sheer callousness of her message, another text popped up. This one was from Vivian, the matriarch of the family, a woman who prided herself on her high society status, her Jack and Jill affiliations, and her extensive charity work within the elite black circles of Atlanta. You Army women are used to roughing it in the dirt, Vivian wrote. Figure it out yourself. You should have planned your little business trips better instead of bothering us. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me, temporarily numbing the physical agony radiating from my spine. This was the same woman who had engineered my divorce, who had looked down on my military service as something fundamentally beneath their refined upper-class pedigree. They truly believed I was nothing but disposable trash. I did not beg. I did not cry. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, locked my jaw, and typed 2 simple words. No worries. Then I closed the chat application, opened my rideshare application, and ordered a vehicle. I dragged myself out to the designated pickup zone every single step, sending shockwaves of blinding pain through my body. When the black sedan finally pulled up to the curb, the driver took one look at my condition, and his eyes went wide with sheer terror. "Ma'am, do I need to call an ambulance?" he asked, his voice shaking as he jumped out to quickly open the back door for me. "Just get me to Atlanta Memorial Hospital as fast and as safely as you possibly can." I ordered, my military command voice taking over despite my deteriorating state. The ride felt like an absolute eternity. I sat in the back seat, gripping the leather armrest so hard my fingers cramped, focusing on the passing streetlights of the city to ground myself. With every brutal contraction, my mind flashed back to the day Julian threw me out of our home. He had stood there wearing his expensive tailored suit, hiding behind his mother Vivian and his smirking white brother-in-law Connor. Connor, who worked as the chief financial officer of Atlanta Memorial, had tossed a settlement check of $50,000 at my feet, telling me to take the money and disappear. Vivian had convinced Julian that he was completely sterile, showing him falsified medical documents. She had poisoned his mind, telling him that my pregnancy was absolute proof of my infidelity, claiming that military women were inherently unfaithful. Julian, the brilliant and respected doctor, had been too cowardly and too entirely controlled by his mother to even question the paperwork she presented. I had walked away that day without a fight, not because I was weak, but because I knew exactly what they were hiding. They thought they had discarded a helpless, dependent soldier. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who held the master keys to their entire digital and financial existence. We screeched to a halt outside the emergency room doors of Atlanta Memorial Hospital. The driver laid heavily on his horn, waving frantically at the medical staff gathered near the entrance. I handed him a crumpled $100 bill from my wallet, ignoring his frantic protests that he did not want my money, and pushed myself out of the vehicle. Nurses rushed forward with a wheelchair, barking medical codes into their radios. I was immediately hoisted into the chair and wheeled rapidly down the sterile, brightly lit corridors. The pain was blinding now, a continuous tearing sensation that consumed my entire reality. Premature labor, 28 weeks, the triage nurse yelled to the attending staff as we crashed through the heavy swinging doors of the emergency maternity ward. We need the senior on-call neonatal specialist in here right now. Page him immediately. I squeezed my eyes shut as they transferred me to the birthing bed. The machines began to beep rapidly, tracking my elevated heart rate and the severely distressed heartbeat of my baby. The room became a chaotic whirlwind of blue scrubs, shouting voices, and clattering medical equipment. Then the main doors of the delivery room swung open. The frantic chatter of the nurses paused for a fraction of a second as the senior on-call doctor stepped into the room, snapping on his sterile gloves. I opened my eyes, fighting through the thick haze of agony, and looked straight into the shocked, horrified face of Julian. My ex-husband. The man who had abandoned me 7 months ago. The man who was now forced by his medical oath to deliver the very child he had completely denied. Julian froze in the doorway as if he had walked into a brick wall. His eyes wide and full of sudden recognition locked onto mine. For a split second, the sterile emergency room felt like it had been stripped of all oxygen. I watched the color drain from his face, replacing his usual arrogant swagger with a mask of absolute horror. The nurses around me did not notice the history stretching between us. They only saw a critical patient and their senior doctor. "Dr. Julian, we have a placental abruption and severe fetal distress," the head nurse urged, gesturing toward the monitors. "We need to move now." Julian took a step back, his jaw clenching so hard I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at the nurse, and then back at me, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Get someone else." "Page Dr. Evans. I am not taking this patient." The head nurse looked at him in sheer disbelief. "Dr. Evans is in surgery, and you are the only senior neonatal specialist on call. The baby is coming right now and her heart rate is dropping. If we wait, they both might not make it." I gripped the metal side rails of the bed, fighting through another massive contraction that felt like my bones were being crushed. My breathing was ragged, but I forced myself to look directly into his eyes. "Do your job, Julian," I ground out between clenched teeth. "Or I promise you the medical board will have your license before morning." The threat hung heavily in the sterile air. Julian knew I was not bluffing. He had spent years underestimating me, believing the lies his mother told him about my intelligence and my capabilities. But he also knew that medical negligence leading to fetal death would ruin the pristine reputation he and his mother valued above all else. He was trapped. With a look of pure disgust, he walked toward the sterile sink and began scrubbing his hands. He snapped orders at the nurses, his voice tight and dripping with resentment. "Prepare the neonatal intensive care unit immediately. Get the incubator ready." He moved to the foot of my bed, his eyes avoiding my face as he snapped on a fresh pair of surgical gloves. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The medical staff exchanged nervous glances, clearly sensing the toxic energy radiating between us, but they remained silent, focused entirely on the critical situation unfolding. As another contraction ripped through me, I let out a sharp gasp. Julian did not offer a word of comfort. There was no holding my hand, no reassuring whispers, no promises that everything would be okay. Instead, he leaned in close while examining the monitors and lowered his voice so only I could hear. "I cannot believe you came to my hospital," he hissed, his tone venomous. "Of all the places in Atlanta you drag your mess here. Where is the father? Out on another deployment." I stared at the ceiling, focusing on a flickering fluorescent light to keep myself from screaming. "You are the only mess here, Julian," I whispered back, my voice trembling with pain but laced with steel. "Just catch the baby and get out of my sight." He scoffed, a bitter sound that was drowned out by the sudden blare of a heart monitor. The baby heart rate was plummeting rapidly. The head nurse shouted a warning, and Julian's demeanor instantly shifted from bitter ex-husband to focused medical professional. It was the only thing I ever respected about him, his undeniable skill as a doctor. "Push," he ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You need to push right now." I gathered every ounce of strength I had left, drawing on the physical endurance forged through years of military training. The pain was an ocean pulling me under, but I refused to drown. I pushed until the edges of my vision went entirely black, until I felt like my body was tearing at the seams. The physical toll of a premature labor was destroying my body from the inside out. I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my neck, matting my hair against the thin hospital gown. Julian barked instructions to the team, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the visible tension radiating from his shoulders. He demanded surgical clamps and fresh towels, his focus entirely consumed by the medical emergency. He was sweating now too, the reality of the situation forcing him to abandon his petty grievances for the sake of the life entering the room. Again he commanded, his voice slicing through the frantic beeping of the machines. "One more big push. Do not stop." I squeezed my eyes shut and gave everything I had left. The room seemed to fade away, leaving only the relentless agony and the desperate need to hear my child cry. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or hours before the crushing pressure suddenly vanished, replaced by a profound emptiness and the frantic movements of the medical team. I collapsed back against the sweat-soaked pillows, gasping for air. My chest heaved as I tried to regain my bearings in the blinding white room. The room was eerily silent for 2 agonizing seconds. Then a thin, reedy wail pierced the air. It was a weak cry, the sound of a premature infant fighting for her first breath. But to me, it was the loudest, most beautiful sound in the entire world. Time of birth. 8:42 in the evening, Julian announced, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He did not look at me. He just stared down at his bloody gloves. The nurses immediately swarmed around the tiny baby, wiping her down and preparing to transfer her to the waiting incubator. I tried to lift my head to see her, but my body was completely drained of energy. "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Is she breathing properly?" Julian did not answer me. He stood near the warming station, his back turned to me, watching as the nurses cleaned the infant. The air in the room remained suffocatingly heavy. I could see the rigid line of his spine, the way his shoulders were hiked up toward his ears. He was desperate to finish the procedure and escape the room to run back to the comfortable, wealthy life his mother had curated for him. He wanted to distance himself from the military trash his mother had always accused me of being. "Bring her here," I demanded, ignoring the exhaustion pulling at my limbs. "I want to see my daughter." One of the nurses carefully wrapped the tiny, fragile baby in a heated blanket. "She is very small, but she is a fighter," the nurse said, offering me a warm, reassuring smile. "The doctor needs to do a final assessment before we move her to the intensive care unit." The nurse stepped back, allowing Julian to approach the warming station for the final check. He moved reluctantly, as if walking toward an execution. He reached down to examine the infant, his face an unreadable mask of clinical detachment. He was supposed to quickly check her vitals, sign the chart, and hand her over to the intensive care team. He was supposed to walk out of my life again and return to his socialite family completely unbothered by the child he was absolutely certain belonged to another man. But as he leaned over the warming tray, The bright overhead surgical lights illuminated the tiny face of the baby girl. The infant squirmed slightly, her tiny hands curling into fists against the cotton blanket. She let out a small breath and slowly opened her eyes for the very first time. The harsh fluorescent lights of the delivery room reflected in those tiny blinking eyes. I watched my daughter take her first real look at the world. But it was not just any look. Even from my bed through the exhaustion and the haze of pain, I could see it. One eye was a rich, deep brown. The other was a striking, icy blue. Heterochromia. The delivery room suddenly went deathly quiet. The frantic energy of the medical staff evaporated. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft cooing of the newborn. I shifted my gaze from my daughter to Julian. He was frozen. His gloved hands were trembling so violently that the baby actually shifted in his grasp. A nurse stepped forward holding a plastic medical clipboard ready to record the APGAR score. "Dr. Julian," she asked, her voice hesitant, "is everything all right?" Julian did not answer. He could not. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a ghost in blue scrubs. He stared at the baby girl in his arms as if she were an apparition. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that his brain simply refused to process. The nurse took another step closer, extending the clipboard. When the plastic clipboard touched Julian's arm, it was as if a spell had been broken. He jumped violently. The clipboard was knocked from the nurse's hand and crashed onto the hard linoleum floor with a sharp crack that echoed off the tile walls. Nobody moved to pick it up. Julian stumbled backward, clutching our daughter to his chest. His eyes darted from the baby face to mine and back again. The sheer panic radiating from him was palpable. The arrogant, composed elite pediatrician was gone. In his place was a man whose entire reality was collapsing under the weight of a biological impossibility. Those eyes, he choked out the words, barely making it past his lips. "Those are my father eyes." I lay back against the pillows, letting the cold satisfaction wash over my exhausted body. I remembered the lavish dinner parties at Vivian Mansion. I remembered Vivian standing in front of a massive oil portrait of her late husband, pointing out his mismatched eyes to her wealthy friends. She used to brag about it endlessly, calling it the unmistakable mark of their aristocratic lineage. She had always lamented that Julian did not inherit the trait. She told everyone it was a royal genetic marker that proved their family superiority. And now that royal marker was staring right back at Julian from the face of the child he had completely denied. Julian took another trembling step away from the warming station. He looked at the baby, and then he looked at me. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The nurses exchanged terrified glances, unsure if they should intervene and take the premature infant from a senior doctor who appeared to be having a total psychological breakdown. How he gasped, shaking his head in rapid, frantic movements. "How is this possible?" I kept my voice dead calm. My tone was flat, completely devoid of the hysteria he expected from a scorned woman. "I told you 7 months ago, Julian. I told you she was yours, but you chose to believe a piece of paper your mother handed you over the word of your own wife." The head nurse finally gathered her courage and stepped forward, extending her arms to take the baby. "Doctor, you need to let us move her to the intensive care unit. Her temperature is dropping. We need to stabilize her." Julian jerked away from the nurse, holding the baby tighter. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Wait, I need a minute. Look at her eyes. Do you see her eyes?" The medical staff stared at him in utter confusion. They did not know the family history. They did not know the significance of the brown and blue irises. They only saw a doctor losing his mind during a critical neonatal emergency. Julian turned his frantic gaze back to me. The denial was fighting a losing battle against the undeniable truth in his arms. He marched back toward the side of my bed, his eyes wild. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, holding the baby between us. "Is she mine?" he screamed, the sound tearing through the sterile room. "Tell me the truth, Aaliyah. Is she my daughter?" The audacity of the question, after what he had put me through, ignited a fire in my chest that burned away the remaining pain of childbirth. I pushed myself up slightly, ignoring the protests of the nurses. I met his panicked gaze with absolute icy resolve. "You threw me out of our home," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You let your mother call me a tramp. You let your brother-in-law toss a $50,000 check at my feet like I was a beggar. You stood there and told me I was a liar because Vivian convinced you that you were sterile." Julian shook his head frantically, tears welling in his eyes. He looked down at the baby girl who was now starting to cry a thin, desperate wail. The blue and brown eyes stared back up at him, a perfect mirrored reflection of the grandfather she would never meet. "I am sterile," he stammered the words, spilling out in a chaotic rush. "The clinic reports the testing. My mother showed me the files, Aaliyah. I saw them with my own eyes. The doctor said I had a 0% chance of ever fathering a child. He said it was a permanent condition. You were deployed. You were gone for 6 months. The math did not make sense. The science did not make sense." I watched him spiral. The cracks in his perfect elite world were spreading fast. He was a man of science, a medical professional who had blindly trusted his mother over his own medical instincts. He had let Vivian hatred for my military background cloud his judgment so completely that he never bothered to verify the documents himself. I reached out and gently took my daughter from his trembling arms. I pulled her to my chest, shielding her from the chaotic energy radiating from the man who had abandoned us. "You really are pathetic, Julian," I whispered, letting the words land like physical blows. "You went through medical school. You hold a license to practice medicine. Yet you let your mother hand you a forged medical file, and you never even thought to ask for a second opinion." The color completely drained from his face. He staggered backward, hitting the medical cart behind him. The stainless steel trays rattled loudly. Forged, he gasped, his hands gripping the edge of the cart to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "What do you mean, forged? My mother would never." I cut him off. "Your mother hates me, Julian. She always has. She could not stand that her precious pediatric surgeon's son married a logistics officer who did not care about her country club memberships or her high society galas. She wanted you to marry a wealthy socialite, so she bought a fake medical diagnosis to convince you I was a cheat, and she succeeded perfectly." Julian looked like he was suffocating. He grabbed the collar of his scrubs, pulling at the fabric as if it were choking him. He looked at the baby, and then at me, his mind finally connecting the devastating dots. The rare genetic trait, the perfectly timed infertility diagnosis, the sudden, swift divorce pushed by his mother and his brother-in-law. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. "No, that is impossible. She would not do that to me. She would not destroy my marriage." I stroked the tiny head of my newborn daughter, feeling her fragile heartbeat against my chest. The nurses had finally mobilized, moving in to respectfully but firmly take the baby to the incubator. I let them take her, knowing she needed the intensive care team. I kept my eyes locked on Julian, watching the exact moment his world shattered. Before he could process another thought, the heavy double doors of the recovery room were suddenly pushed open. Loud, demanding voices echoed from the hallway outside. The sharp click of expensive designer heels hit the linoleum floor. I did not even need to look to know who had just arrived. The vultures had landed. The surgical lights blazed overhead, casting harsh white reflections in those tiny blinking eyes. I watched my newborn daughter take her first real look at the world. Through the bone-deep exhaustion and the fading haze of physical pain, I could see it clearly. One eye was a rich, deep mahogany brown. The other was a striking, icy blue. Heterochromia. The delivery room suddenly went deathly quiet. The frantic energy of the medical staff completely evaporated. The only sounds left were the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors and the soft cooing of the premature infant. I shifted my gaze from my daughter directly to Julian. He was frozen in place. His gloved hands were trembling so violently that the baby actually shifted in his awkward grasp. A senior nurse stepped forward, holding a plastic medical clipboard ready to record the APGAR score. "Dr. Julian?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Is everything all right?" Julian did not answer. He simply could not. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost in his blue scrubs. He stared at the baby girl in his arms as if she were an apparition. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that his brain simply refused to process. The nurse took another step closer, extending the clipboard toward him. When the edge of the plastic touched his arm, it was as if a spell had been broken. Julian jumped violently. The clipboard was knocked from the nurse's hand and crashed onto the hard linoleum floor with a sharp crack that echoed loudly off the tile walls. Nobody moved to pick it up. Julian stumbled backward, clutching our daughter awkwardly to his chest. His eyes darted from the baby face to mine and back again. The sheer panic radiating from him was palpable in the sterile air. The arrogant, composed elite pediatrician was entirely gone. In his place was a man whose entire reality was collapsing under the weight of a biological impossibility. Those eyes, he choked out the words, barely making it past his trembling lips. Those are my father eyes. I lay back against the hospital pillows, letting a wave of cold satisfaction wash over my exhausted body. I remembered the lavish dinner parties at Vivian's sprawling mansion in Buckhead. I remembered Vivian standing proudly in front of a massive oil portrait of her late husband, pointing out his mismatched eyes to her wealthy friends. She used to brag about it endlessly, calling it the unmistakable mark of their aristocratic lineage. She had always lamented that Julian did not inherit the trait. She told everyone in her high society circle that it was a royal genetic marker that proved their family superiority. And now that royal marker was staring right back at Julian from the face of the child he had completely denied. Julian took another trembling step away from the warming station. He looked at the baby, and then he looked at me, his chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The nurses exchanged terrified glances, unsure if they should intervene and take the premature infant from a senior doctor who appeared to be having a total psychological breakdown. How he gasped, shaking his head in rapid, frantic movements. How is this possible? I kept my voice dead calm. My tone was flat, completely devoid of the hysteria he expected from a scorned woman. I told you 7 months ago, Julian. I told you she was yours. But you chose to believe a piece of paper your mother handed you over the word of your own wife. The head nurse finally gathered her courage and stepped forward, extending her arms to take the baby. Doctor, you need to let us move her to the intensive care unit. Her temperature is dropping. We need to stabilize her right now. Julian jerked away from the nurse, holding the baby tighter. No, he shouted, his voice cracking. Wait. I need a minute. Look at her eyes. Do you see her eyes? The medical staff stared at him in utter confusion. They did not know the elite family history. They did not know the significance of the brown and blue irises. They only saw a doctor losing his mind during a critical neonatal emergency. Julian turned his frantic gaze back to me. The denial was fighting a losing battle against the undeniable truth resting in his arms. He marched back toward the side of my bed, his eyes completely wild. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, holding the baby between us. Is she mine? He screamed, the sound tearing through the sterile room. Tell me the truth, Aaliyah. Is she my daughter? He grabbed his hair, pulling at the blue surgical cap. This is impossible, Aaliyah. You were deployed. You were stationed at the military base for 6 months. I know what you did. You slept with a fellow soldier. You slept with someone in your unit and tried to pin it on me. The nurses gasped softly. They were witnessing a senior doctor having a complete mental breakdown in front of his own patient. Julian paced the floor, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the linoleum. My mother showed me the files. He was rambling now, desperate to convince himself. Vivian brought the lab results directly to my office. She sat me down in her velvet parlor and opened the folder. The fertility clinic confirmed it. Complete sterility. 0 viable count. My mother wept for me, Aaliyah. She told me military women were unfaithful. She said it was only natural you would find comfort in the arms of a soldier while you were away. She had the medical proof right there on the hospital letterhead. I felt the nurses shifting uncomfortably. They wanted to intervene to tend to my post-delivery care, but Julian's erratic behavior kept them paralyzed. I did not need their protection. I had survived combat zones and intelligence briefings that would make Julian weep. I pushed myself up against the thin hospital pillows. The pain in my lower abdomen was severe, but I ignored it completely. I looked directly into his panicked, terrified eyes. My voice was calm, cold, and completely steady. "You are a doctor, Julian." I spoke slowly, letting every single syllable land like a physical blow. "You are a highly respected specialist at one of the most elite hospitals in Atlanta. You spent years in medical school, yet you let your mother read your own medical files." He stopped pacing. The words struck him. I could see the gears turning in his head, fighting against years of ingrained obedience to the matriarch of his family. "Vivian is on the hospital charity board," he stammered, his voice losing its volume. "She has access to the administrative directors. She picked up the results to save me the trip. She is my mother. Why would she lie to me?" "She lie? Because she despised me, Julian." I did not raise my voice, but the quiet intensity of my tone filled the room. "She hated that you married a logistics officer instead of a debutante from her social circles. She wanted to preserve your elite bloodline, so she bought a fake diagnosis. She bribed a clinic doctor to print a false report and handed it to you. And you were too arrogant and too cowardly to simply ask for a second opinion." Julian looked from me to the incubator, where the neonatal nurses were quickly preparing to transport our daughter. He saw those eyes again, the undeniable biological proof of his paternity, the proof that he had thrown away his family for absolutely nothing. "No," he whispered, backing away until his shoulders hit the heavy wooden cabinets. "She would not do that. She promised me she was protecting our family legacy." "She protected her own ego," I replied sharply. "And you let her. You let her brother-in-law Connor toss a $50,000 divorce settlement check at me like I was a beggar on the street. You stood by while they called me trash." The lead nurse finally stepped between us. "Dr. Julian, we are transferring the infant to the neonatal intensive care unit now. You need to step back." Julian did not argue. He looked completely hollowed out. He watched numbly as the team wheeled the incubator out of the room, taking his daughter away. Within 20 minutes, I was moved to a private recovery room on the 4th floor. The room was spacious and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the delivery ward. The nurses helped me settle into the bed, checking my intravenous fluids and adjusting the blankets. I closed my eyes for just a moment, allowing the sheer physical exhaustion to wash over me. The door clicked open softly. Julian stepped into the recovery room. He had removed his surgical cap and gloves. He looked like a broken man. He slowly approached the side of my bed, his hands trembling at his sides. "Aaliyah," he whispered, his voice cracking with unshed tears. "I am so sorry. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know. If I had known she was mine, I never would have signed those papers." He dropped to his knees right beside my bed. The great Dr. Julian kneeling on the cold floor of his own hospital, begging for forgiveness. He reached out tentatively, wanting to hold my hand. "Do not touch me," I commanded. My voice was a whip. "You made your choice when you let your mother hand you my eviction notice." He sobbed quietly, his head bowed. "Please, Aaliyah, we can fix this. I will talk to my mother." Before he could utter another pathetic promise, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my room. The distinct, sharp clicking of expensive designer heels grew louder and faster. Julian froze, his head snapping toward the entrance. The heavy wooden doors of the recovery room were suddenly shoved open with violent force. The air in the room instantly grew suffocatingly cold. I shifted my gaze toward the doorway, perfectly prepared for the battle that was about to commence. Standing there in her tailored silk blazer and immaculate pearls was Vivian. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. Right behind her was Jasmine, holding a designer handbag like a weapon. And leaning casually against the doorframe, wearing his signature smug grin, was Connor. Vivian marched into my recovery room like she owned the entire hospital building. She wore a tailored ivory suit that probably cost more than the nurses' annual salaries. Her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Julian, who was still kneeling on the cold floor. "Get up, Julian," she snapped, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family." Jasmine flanked her mother, crossing her arms over her designer blouse. I told you we should have barred her from this facility, Mother Jasmine sneered, looking at me as if I were a piece of garbage stuck to her shoe. The audacity of her coming here to stage this pathetic little drama. Connor stepped out from behind them, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke jacket. He had that same slimy, condescending smile he wore the day he handed me my eviction notice. I handled this trash 7 months ago, he said smoothly, patting Julian on the shoulder. Come on, Julian, you are a respected pediatrician. You do not need to be groveling in front of a woman who just birthed another bastard child. Vivian stepped closer to the foot of my bed. Her gaze was pure venom. I always knew you were nothing but military trash, Aaliyah. She spat the words out, like they tasted bitter in her mouth. You tricked my son into marriage, hoping to secure a comfortable life for yourself. And when you realized we would never accept your low-class background, you went out and got pregnant by some random soldier. Now you drag your mess into our hospital, trying to use a bastard child to extort our noble family. You are completely delusional if you think we will ever give you another dime. Connor chuckled a dry, humorless sound. He leaned against the medical tray table, folding his arms. $50,000, Aaliyah, he said, shaking his head in mock pity. That was the pathetic settlement I forced you to sign when I drew up those divorce papers. $50,000 to walk away and never bother this family again. It was far more than a lowly army contractor deserved, but we considered it the cost of taking out the trash. I told security to throw you out the moment you were discharged, but here you are still trying to claw your way into the family vault. Julian slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He did not look at me. He stared directly at his mother. His hands were trembling, but his expression was shifting from despair to a cold, terrifying realization. Vivian reached out to brush a stray piece of lint from his scrubs, but Julian violently slapped her hand away. "Do not touch me," he snarled. Vivian blinked in shock. "Julian, darling, what is wrong with you? This woman has clearly upset you. We are going to have her transferred to a public clinic immediately." I laid back against the thin hospital pillows and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk blindly into a trap. I looked at Vivian and then at Connor, letting my silence stretch until the room grew suffocatingly tense. "You really are a piece of work, Vivian," I said calmly. "You went through all the trouble of fabricating medical records, bribing clinic staff, and destroying your son's marriage just to keep your precious bloodline pure." Vivian stiffened, her posture becoming rigid. "I have no idea what you are talking about, you deranged woman," she scoffed, but I could see the sudden panic flashing in her eyes. I ignored her and looked at my ex-husband. "I told you, Julian," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You are a brilliant doctor, a man of science. Yet you let your mother read your own medical files. You let her hand you a forged document, claiming you were entirely sterile, and you never once questioned it. You threw away your wife and your unborn child because your mother hated my military background." Connor stepped forward, pointing a finger at me. "That is enough," he shouted, his face turning red. "You are not going to sit here and slander this family. I am calling hospital security right now and having you physically removed from this bed. You took the $50,000. You signed the non-disclosure agreements. You have absolutely no rights here." I laughed, a genuine dark sound that made Connor freeze. $50,000, I repeated, shaking my head. "You really thought I took that $50,000 because I needed it? You thought I walked away quietly because I was a helpless little soldier who did not know how to fight back?" Julian interrupted, his voice shaking with a rage I had never heard from him before. He stepped toward his mother, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Her eyes, mother," he whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the neonatal intensive care unit down the hall. "The baby." I held her. I looked at her face. Vivian scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I do not care what the little brat looks like, Julian. We are leaving right now." "She has heterochromia," Julian screamed, the sound echoing off the walls. "One blue eye and one brown eye. Exactly like father. Exactly like the genetic trait you brag about at every single charity dinner." The silence that followed his words was absolute. Vivian's face completely drained of color. She stood frozen, staring at Julian, as if the ground had suddenly opened up beneath her feet. Jasmine dropped her designer handbag, and it hit the floor with a heavy thud. Connor's mouth fell open, his arrogant smirk completely wiped away. They all realized exactly what that meant. The child they had just called a bastard was carrying the undeniable royal mark of their own bloodline. The child they had just called a bastard was carrying the undeniable royal mark of their own bloodline. Vivian was the first to break the suffocating silence. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. "No," she stammered, her voice stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "That is impossible. It is a trick. She is trying to trick us, Julian. You cannot believe this manipulative military trash." Jasmine took a step backward, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway where the neonatal intensive care unit was located. "Mother, we both know that trait skipped our generation," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If the baby has those eyes, then Julian really is the father." Connor's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He aggressively stepped in front of his wife and mother-in-law, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "I do not care what color the kid eyes are," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You signed a legally binding settlement, Aaliyah. $50,000 to completely sever all ties to this family. You have no claim to Julian wealth, and you certainly have no claim to remain in my hospital. I am the chief financial officer of this medical center, and I am ordering you to pack your pathetic little bags and leave before I have you thrown out onto the street." I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even flinch at his aggressive posturing. I simply leaned over to the rolling tray table beside my hospital bed and picked up my phone. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of fear. "Are you calling a lawyer?" Connor sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because I can assure you that your cheap military pension will not cover the legal fees required to fight my corporate team. You are completely out of your depth here, Aaliyah. Just take your bastard child and disappear before I make your life a living hell." I ignored his pathetic threats and pressed a single button on my phone screen. The call connected instantly. "We have a pest control issue in recovery room 4. I said, my voice entirely calm. "I need them removed immediately." I dropped the phone back onto the tray table and folded my hands over my lap. Vivian let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Pest control," she mocked, adjusting her silk blazer. "You really are losing your mind, Aaliyah. Did you just call hospital maintenance to remove us? You are more delusional than I thought. Connor is the chief financial officer. He practically owns this building. No one is going to touch us." Julian was still backed against the wooden cabinets, watching the exchange with wide, horrified eyes. He looked completely paralyzed, trapped between the mother who had ruined his life and the wife he had thrown away. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy wooden doors of the recovery room swung open. Marcus, the head of hospital security, marched into the room. He was a massive man wearing a crisp tactical uniform, followed closely by 4 of his largest security officers. Connor smiled triumphantly. "Ah, Marcus." "Perfect timing," he commanded, stepping toward the security chief with absolute arrogant authority. "I need you to forcibly remove this patient from the premises. She is causing a disturbance and threatening my family. Escort her out the back delivery entrance so she does not upset the paying patients." Marcus did not even blink at the chief financial officer. He completely ignored Connor's outstretched hand and marched straight past him. The 4 security guards fanned out, forming a solid wall between my hospital bed and Vivian's toxic family. Marcus stopped at the foot of my bed and clasped his hands behind his back. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Boss," he said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet room. "Are you okay? Do you want these individuals permanently removed from the premises?" The entire room froze. Connor's jaw practically unhinged. He stared at Marcus as if the massive security chief had just sprouted a second head. "What did you just call her?" he demanded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "I am the chief financial officer of Atlanta Memorial Hospital. I sign your paychecks, Marcus. You take orders from me. Grab that woman and throw her out right now." Marcus slowly turned to face Connor. His expression was a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. "You sign the checks for the medical staff, Connor," he stated flatly. You do not sign my checks. My entire department was outsourced 3 months ago to a federal cybersecurity and logistics firm to handle the new integrated security grid. We do not work for Atlanta Memorial Hospital anymore. We work for her. Marcus gestured respectfully toward me. Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. Jasmine let out a small, terrified squeak and shrank behind her mother. Julian looked like he was about to pass out on the linoleum floor. Connor's face morphed from crimson red to a sickly shade of gray. He looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. "That is impossible," he stammered, taking a shaky step backward. "The firm that bought the hospital's security contract is a massive federal contractor. They handle tactical logistics and digital infrastructure for the entire eastern seaboard. You are just a low-level army clerk. You cannot possibly own that firm." I let a slow, chilling smile touch my lips. "I never said I was a low-level clerk, Connor," I replied, my voice slicing through his arrogance like a razor blade. "You and Vivian just assumed I was beneath you because I served in the military. You assumed I was uneducated because I did not go to your elite private schools. But while you were busy playing country club politics and forcing my husband to sign divorce papers, I was busy acquiring the master security and digital infrastructure contracts for this entire medical network. I am the chief executive officer. I own the servers that hold your financial records. I own the security cameras that watch your every move. And as of right now, I own the security team that is going to throw you out of my hospital room." Connor began to hyperventilate. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape from the nightmare he had blindly walked into. He had built his entire identity on being the untouchable elite financial wizard of the hospital, and in 10 seconds I had completely stripped him of his power. "Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Vivian's horrified face, "escort them out. If they resist or cause a scene in the hallway, you have my full authorization to have them arrested for trespassing and harassment." "Understood, boss," Marcus replied with a sharp nod. He turned to his men. "You heard the lady. Clear the room." The 4 massive security guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Connor by his expensive tailored jacket. He shrieked in protest, flailing his arms as they effortlessly lifted him off his feet. "Do not touch me," he screamed, his voice echoing down the hospital corridor. "I will have you all fired. I will sue this entire firm." Vivian tried to maintain her aristocratic dignity, but her hands were shaking violently as a guard pointed toward the door. "You cannot do this, Aaliyah," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute fury and deeply buried terror. "You are making a massive mistake. You are going to regret humiliating this family." "Get out, Vivian," I ordered, my voice cold and hard, "and do not ever come near me or my daughter again." Jasmine was already running out the door, crying hysterically as she chased after her screaming husband. Vivian glared at me one last time, her eyes filled with pure venom, before she turned and marched out of the room, her pristine ivory suit looking suddenly ridiculous and pathetic. The security guards hauled Connor out into the hallway, his expensive leather shoes dragging against the floor as he continued to shout empty threats. Marcus gave me one final respectful nod before stepping out and pulling the heavy wooden doors firmly shut behind him. The recovery room plunged back into total silence. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly draining from my exhausted body. The physical toll of the premature birth was catching up to me, but the emotional victory was a powerful anesthetic. I had waited 7 long, agonizing months for this exact moment, and it was sweeter than I could have ever imagined. I turned my head and looked at Julian. He was still standing against the wooden cabinets, completely forgotten in the chaos of the security eviction. He looked entirely broken. His mother was gone. His arrogant brother-in-law had been physically carried out like trash. The elite world he had chosen over me was actively crumbling to dust around him. Julian slowly slid down the front of the cabinets until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his hands. He was crying quietly, a pathetic broken sound that echoed in the sterile room. He had finally realized the absolute catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He had thrown away his wife and his child because he was too weak to stand up to his mother. He had trusted forged documents over the woman who loved him. And now he was sitting on the floor of a hospital room completely alone, while the woman he discarded held the absolute power to destroy his entire life. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply closed my eyes and listened to the sound of his tears, knowing this was only the beginning of my revenge. The heavy leather seats of the armored town car offered no comfort as Vivian sank into the back. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. Jasmine sat beside her, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Connor paced the length of the private parking garage before finally sliding into the seat opposite them. He slammed his fist against the privacy glass separating them from the driver. The car lurched forward, leaving the hospital behind, but the sheer terror of what had just happened clung to them like a suffocating shroud. "Shut up, Jasmine." Vivian hissed, her voice sharp and brittle. "Stop crying this instant. We have a massive crisis on our hands, and your whining is not helping." Jasmine choked on a sob, shrinking back against the leather interior. "But Mother, she owns the security firm. Aaliyah owns the entire grid. How are we supposed to fight that?" Connor ripped his silk tie loose, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and absolute dread. "The security contract is the least of our problems," he growled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Do you understand what just happened in that hospital room, Vivian? Did you see the child?" Vivian closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the tinted window. She saw it. She saw the unmistakable mismatched eyes staring back at her, the icy blue and the rich mahogany brown. It was the exact genetic marker of her late husband. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that the baby belonged to Julian. When they arrived at the sprawling Buckhead mansion, Vivian immediately dismissed Jasmine, sending her to her room like a scolded child. Vivian and Connor walked straight into the mahogany-paneled study. Vivian locked the heavy double doors behind them. She did not bother pouring a drink. Her hands were shaking too violently to hold a crystal glass. Connor collapsed into one of the leather wingback chairs. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. $50 million, Vivian, he whispered, the number sounding like a death sentence in the quiet room. "If that child gets a DNA test, we are going to lose the $50 million. "Keep your voice down," Vivian snapped, pacing across the Persian rug. "The staff might hear you." But the panic in her own voice betrayed her commanding tone. It was the darkest, closely guarded secret of the elite family. When Julian's father passed away, he did not leave his vast empire to his wife. He knew Vivian was frivolous and obsessed with social climbing. He knew she would squander the family legacy on charity galas and meaningless status symbols. So he locked the core of his fortune in an ironclad trust fund. $50 million sitting in offshore accounts gathering massive interest. The stipulations of the will were incredibly specific. The money could only be touched by the first direct bloodline grandchild. Vivian had spent years raging against that will. She had pushed Julian to marry a suitable woman from their elite circles, hoping to control the inevitable grandchild. When Julian married Aaliyah, a military logistics officer with no family pedigree, Vivian saw her control slipping away. She hated Aaliyah. She hated her independence. She hated that Aaliyah could not be bought or bullied. So Vivian had orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. She paid off the director of a private fertility clinic. She had false medical records drafted stating that Julian was completely permanently sterile. She planted the seed of doubt in her son's mind, convinced him his wife was unfaithful, and orchestrated the divorce the moment Aaliyah deployed overseas. Connor was the chief financial officer of the family holdings. He was the one who found the loophole in the grandfather trust. While the principal $50 million remained locked until a grandchild was born, Connor had figured out how to siphon the massive interest payments. For the past 4 years, Vivian and Connor had been secretly draining millions of dollars from the accounts. They used the stolen cash to fund their lavish lifestyle, to prop up failing investments, and to maintain their illusion of infinite wealth. If Julian never had a child, the trust would eventually dissolve into the general estate, and Vivian could claim it all. That was the plan. It was a perfect, flawless scheme. Until today. Connor stood up, pacing the length of the study like a trapped animal. "We are completely ruined, Vivian," he panicked, his voice rising. If Aaliyah orders a DNA test for that baby, the trust fund automatically unlocks. The bank will immediately transfer control of the 50 million to the child. And since the child is a minor, Aaliyah will be named the primary financial guardian. She will have full access to the accounts. Vivian gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning white. She will not just get the money, Connor, she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The moment the trust transfers, the federal bank will conduct a mandatory audit of the last 10 years. They will track every single penny. They will see the unauthorized wire transfers. They will see the shell companies you set up in the Cayman Islands. Connor's face went completely ashen. He grabbed the back of the leather chair, gasping for air. Fraud, Vivian. Grand larceny. Embezzlement. We are looking at federal prison time. I will lose my corporate licenses. You will lose this house. The entire high society circle will watch us get dragged out of here in handcuffs. We cannot let that happen, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing as her survival instincts finally kicked in. We have to stop her. We have to make sure that DNA test never happens. How Connor demanded, throwing his hands in the air. You saw her in that hospital room. She is not the helpless little soldier you thought she was. She owns a massive federal cybersecurity firm. She had me physically thrown out of my own hospital. She has Julian completely broken. He was kneeling on the floor, sobbing over that baby. If Julian demands the paternity test, we cannot stop him. He is the biological father. Vivian paced faster, her mind spinning through every possible scenario. Julian is weak, she stated coldly. He has always been weak. He will do whatever I tell him to do. I just need to get him away from Aaliyah. I need to convince him that the baby is not his. I will tell him Aaliyah found a sperm donor with the same eye condition. I will tell him it is a genetic coincidence. He wants to believe me, Connor. He wants to believe his mother would never lie to him. Connor shook his head bitterly. You are delusional, Vivian. You did not see the way he looked at that child. He knows. Deep down, he absolutely knows that baby is a part of him. And Aaliyah is not going to just walk away. Why did she wait 7 months to tell him? Why did she wait until the baby was born? Because she was building her trap, Vivian hissed, pounding her fist on the desk. She used her military contracts to build that security company. She waited until she had enough power to humiliate us. She wants to destroy this family. Then we have to destroy her first. Connor said, his voice turning dangerously dark. We cannot play country club politics anymore, Vivian. This is not about social standing. This is about staying out of federal prison. We need to eliminate Aaliyah's credibility. We need to frame her for something so massive that the courts will declare her an unfit mother. If she goes to prison, the state takes the baby and the trust remains locked. Vivian looked at her son-in-law. The panic in her chest was slowly being replaced by a cold, ruthless calculation. She had not spent her entire life clawing her way to the top of Buckhead elite society just to lose it all to a smug military contractor. She would not let Aaliyah take the $50 million. She would not let a bastard child inherit the family legacy. We need access to her company servers, Vivian said, her mind working rapidly. If she handles federal logistics, there must be classified data. If we can plant evidence of corporate espionage or treason, the federal government will raid her entire operation. They will lock her away for decades. Connor nodded slowly, a sinister smile creeping back onto his face. I still have contacts in the dark web. People who specialize in corporate sabotage. It will cost us a fortune, but we can siphon one last massive payment from the trust to cover the fee. We frame her for selling federal security secrets. The military will handle the rest. They do not show mercy to traitors. Vivian walked over to the heavy velvet drapes and pulled them shut, plunging the study into shadows. Do it, she commanded. Drain whatever funds you need. Call your contacts tonight. Aaliyah thinks she has won because she humiliated us in a hospital room. But she has absolutely no idea who she is dealing with. We are going to take everything from her. We are going to ensure that child never sees a single penny of my husband's money. Connor pulled out his encrypted phone, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. Consider it done, he murmured. By the end of the week, Aaliyah will be begging us to save her. Vivian stood in the dark study, her heart pounding with a toxic mixture of fear and anticipation. The battle lines had been drawn. It was no longer just a bitter family dispute over a divorce settlement. It was a war for $50 million, and Vivian was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure she was the only one left standing. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and quiet victories. I brought my daughter home to the secure penthouse I had purchased under a shell company. I named her Maya. She was perfect and completely mine. But I knew Vivian and Connor were not going to simply surrender. Animals fight hardest when they are cornered. I just did not expect them to sink to the level they did. It was a Tuesday morning when the heavy knocking echoed through my front door. I checked the security feeds on my tablet. Standing in my hallway were two uniformed police officers and a stern-looking woman in a gray suit holding a thick manila folder. My security detail in the lobby had already flagged them. They had a federal warrant. I set Maya down in her crib and walked to the door, taking a deep breath before pulling it open. "Are you Aaliyah?" the woman asked, stepping forward with absolute authority. "I am Rebecca from Child Protective Services. We received a high-priority report regarding the safety and welfare of your infant daughter. We need to come inside immediately." I stood my ground, crossing my arms. I asked her what she was talking about. Rebecca handed me a stack of papers. The header on the first page made my blood run cold. The document was a detailed psychiatric evaluation. It claimed I suffered from severe combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder. It described fabricated episodes of violent hysteria and paranoid delusions. The report stated I was an active danger to myself and my newborn child. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It belonged to a highly respected military psychiatrist, a doctor who just happened to sit on the board of Vivian's favorite charity foundation. Vivian had used her elite social connections and her endless supply of dirty money to buy a fake medical diagnosis. Rebecca pushed past me into the living room, her eyes scanning the immaculate space, looking for any sign of chaos. The police officers stood by the door, hands resting near their tactical belts. "We have an emergency court order," Rebecca stated flatly. "The biological father, Dr. Julian, has filed for immediate sole custody. He expressed deep concern for the safety of his daughter. Given your documented psychological instability, the court has granted a temporary removal order. We are here to take the child, Aaliyah." I did not scream or panic. The military had trained me to maintain a frozen calm under direct enemy fire. I read the documents again, my mind processing the sheer audacity of Vivian's strategy. They could not beat me in a fair fight, so they decided to use the state to steal my child. Vivian had leveraged every ounce of her black elite power to pull this off. She had called in favors from judges she played tennis with. She had bribed state officials who attended her lavish Buckhead dinner parties. Connor had clearly funneled the bribe money through his untraceable corporate accounts to secure the fake psychiatric evaluation. I knew exactly why they were doing this. My security team had already decrypted Connor financial records the night before. I had seen the offshore accounts and the massive siphoning of Julian grandfather estate. I knew all about the $50 million trust fund that was legally destined for Maya. If Vivian and Connor could have me declared mentally unfit, they could strip away my maternal rights and hand custody of Maya straight to Julian. Julian was completely under Vivian control. That meant Vivian would become the de facto financial guardian of the $50 million. She would gain absolute access to the cash flow she needed to stay out of federal prison. She was running a vicious, sickening smear campaign just to protect her stolen wealth. I looked at the social worker. I kept my voice completely steady. "You are making a terrible mistake, Rebecca," I said. "These medical records are entirely forged. I have never been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I have never exhibited violent tendencies. You are being manipulated by a family desperate to secure a $50 million trust fund." Rebecca shook her head, her expression turning sympathetic but firm. "I hear this all the time," she replied. "People in denial often create elaborate conspiracy theories to justify their paranoia. It is a classic symptom of your condition. We are not here to debate your financial delusions. We are here to ensure the safety of an infant." Step away from the hallway, Aaliyah. Do not make us use force. I looked at the armed police officers. If I fought them, they would arrest me for resisting and assaulting an officer. That would only validate Vivian fabricated psychological report. They wanted me to act crazy. They wanted me to lose my temper and prove their lies were true. I took a slow, calculated breath and stepped back. I walked into the nursery and gently picked up Maya, wrapping her in a warm blanket. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as I walked back to the living room and handed my beautiful daughter over to the social worker. "You tell Vivian something for me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as Rebecca took the baby. "You tell her she just made the biggest mistake of her miserable life. You tell her that I am coming for everything." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the sudden crushing silence of the penthouse. I watched from the floor-to-ceiling windows as the unmarked government vehicle drove away, carrying my entire world inside it. The glass felt cold against my forehead. The silence in the empty nursery behind me was deafening. But the despair only lasted for a fleeting second before the cold, calculating mindset of a tactical commander completely took over. I walked straight to my secure terminal and booted up the master system. I pulled up the encrypted profiles of the judge who signed the order and the psychiatrist who forged my medical history. Vivian wanted to play dirty. She wanted to use her corrupt high society friends as weapons to steal my flesh and blood. She thought taking my baby would break my spirit and force me to surrender. She had absolutely no idea what kind of war she had just started. I began typing rapidly executing commands that would trace every digital footprint Vivian and Connor had ever left. I was going to burn their elite empire to the ground and take back my daughter. Julian was still huddled on the cold linoleum floor of my recovery room, his shoulders shaking with pathetic sobs. I did not have time to relish his despair before the heavy wooden doors swung open once again. Two women walked in wearing sharp practical suits, followed closely by a man carrying a thick leather briefcase. Their expressions were completely devoid of empathy. The taller woman stepped past Julian without even glancing at him and approached the side of my bed. "Are you Aaliyah?" she asked, her voice strictly professional. "I am Rebecca, from Child Protective Services, and we are here to gather evidence regarding an emergency welfare report filed against you." My heart rate spiked, but my military training immediately kicked in, locking my face into a mask of total calm. I watched as the man with the briefcase stepped forward and slapped a thick stack of legal documents right onto my tray table. "You have been served," he stated flatly before turning on his heel and walking out the door. I looked down at the documents. The bold black letters across the top read, "Emergency subpoena and temporary custody injunction." Vivian had wasted absolutely no time. While Connor was being dragged out by my security team, she had already activated her backup plan. Rebecca pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "We received a highly credible report detailing severe psychiatric instability." She continued, her eyes scanning the sterile room. "The report includes sworn affidavits claiming you suffer from combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder and violent manic episodes. The biological father, Dr. Julian, has filed an emergency petition for sole physical custody to protect the infant from potential harm." I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. He had finally lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red and swollen, but there was a flicker of cowardly hope in them. He thought his mother was saving him. He actually thought Vivian cared about his daughter when all she really wanted was to lock down the $50 million trust fund that was legally destined for the first direct bloodline grandchild. If Vivian could strip away my maternal rights, she could control Julian and thereby control the massive cash flow she and Connor had been secretly siphoning for years. Rebecca tapped her screen. "We will be interviewing the hospital staff and reviewing your medical charts," she said. "The temporary injunction mandates a full psychiatric evaluation before you can be discharged with the child. Until then, the infant remains in the neonatal intensive care unit under strict hospital supervision." "Do you understand the severity of these allegations, Aaliyah?" "I understand exactly what is happening here, Rebecca," I replied, my voice completely steady. "You are being used as a pawn by a desperately corrupt family trying to protect a $50 million offshore trust. I suggest you do your job thoroughly, because you are going to find absolutely nothing. The social workers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly accustomed to denial. They informed me they would be speaking to the attending physicians and left the room, leaving me alone with Julian once again. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his expensive scrubs wrinkled and stained with tears. "Aaliyah," he whispered, taking a hesitant step toward my bed. "My mother is just trying to do what is best. You need help. The deployment changed you. If you just cooperate, we can raise her together. My mother promised she would drop the petition if you agreed to a psychological hold." I stared at the man I had once loved, feeling nothing but absolute pity. "You are a puppet, Julian," I said coldly. "Vivian does not want your daughter. She wants the grandfather trust fund, and she will destroy both of us to keep it. Get out of my room." He opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer finality in my eyes stopped him. He turned and stumbled out of the room, closing the door behind him. The moment I was completely alone, the cold, calculating mindset of a tactical commander took over. I did not break down. I did not cry over the subpoena sitting on my tray table. Vivian thought she could use her black elite power to buy state officials and manipulate child protective services. She thought she could bury me in corrupt bureaucratic red tape. She had no idea that I held the keys to the entire federal oversight grid. I reached for my phone and opened a highly encrypted secure channel. I dialed a specific sequence of numbers that bypassed all standard telecom networks. The line connected immediately. "Boss," a sharp professional voice answered. It was Marcus speaking from the Secure Operations Center downstairs. "Marcus." "It is time," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet tone. "The mother just escalated. They filed a fraudulent Child Protective Services report and served me with an emergency custody subpoena. They are trying to have me declared psychologically unfit to steal the trust fund." "I understand the severity, boss," Marcus replied instantly. "What are your orders?" "I am officially activating Operation White Angel," I commanded. There was a brief pause on the line as the weight of that authorization settled in. Operation White Angel was not a standard corporate maneuver. It was a massive federal-level medical audit protocol. It gave my cybersecurity firm absolute authorization to bypass hospital administrators and initiate a total lockdown of all internal communications, financial records, and pharmaceutical inventories. "Understood, boss," Marcus said, his voice thrumming with anticipation. "Initiating federal audit protocols now. All hospital network servers are being locked and mirrored. We are isolating Connor financial directories and cross-referencing every single diagnostic report Vivian has ever authorized. Listen to me carefully, Marcus." I continued, pulling the laptop from my overnight bag. "I am stepping in as the undercover director of this audit. I want full access to the pediatric department records. I want every file, every billing invoice, and every donor list connected to Vivian Charity Foundation routed directly to my terminal. If she wants to claim I am medically unfit, I am going to expose every single piece of medical fraud her family has committed in this hospital over the last decade." "Consider it done," Marcus replied. "The digital perimeter is secure. They cannot delete a single email without our knowledge." I ended the call and opened my laptop screen. Lines of code began pouring across the monitor as Marcus' team granted me master access to the hospital mainframe. Vivian and Connor had played their best card. They had tried to paint me as a violent, broken soldier unfit to raise a child. But they had just handed a loaded weapon to a master tactician. I sat in my hospital bed, the glowing screen illuminating my face in the dark room, and began to dismantle their corrupt empire piece by piece. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in the sterile hospital room. I had been typing for hours, watching the encrypted files from the pediatric ward and Vivian Charity Foundation download into my secure servers. The depth of their fraud was staggering. They had been using the hospital infrastructure to launder money for years. Every keystroke I made was another nail in their collective coffin. I was just about to initiate the final sequence to lock them out of their own bank accounts when a soft, hesitant knock echoed through the room. The heavy door slowly creaked open. Julian stood in the doorway looking like a completely different man than the arrogant heir who had strutted into my life years ago. His expensive designer clothes were rumpled. Dark circles hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. His hair was a disheveled mess. He looked exactly like a man who had finally realized the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. He stepped into the room clutching a white envelope against his chest. He looked at my laptop and then at my face, his expression twisting into a mask of pure agony. "Aaliyah," he whispered, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I came as soon as I could get away from her. I had to see you. I had to tell you the truth before this goes any further." I did not close my laptop. I simply lowered the screen slightly, keeping my hands resting on the keyboard. I stared at him, waiting in absolute silence. My military training had taught me that silence was a weapon that forced an enemy to reveal their true intentions. Julian swallowed hard and took another step forward. He held out the white envelope with trembling hands. "I did it," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I went to a private lab across the city. I bypassed my mother's security team, and I ran a rapid genetic sequence using the blood samples from the hospital registry. It is a certified DNA test, Aaliyah." He let the envelope drop onto the foot of my bed. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for salvation. "Maya is mine." He choked out a sob tearing from his throat. "She is my daughter, Aaliyah. She has my eyes. She has my blood. The test proves everything you said was true." I looked at the envelope and then back at the pathetic man standing before me. I felt no vindication. I felt no warmth. I only felt a cold, calculating certainty. I knew he was playing a game. Julian was a coward, but he was not stupid. He knew the federal audit was coming. He knew his mother empire was vulnerable. He was trying to jump from a sinking ship and secure his place on a life raft. "I am so sorry, Aaliyah," Julian cried out, dropping to his knees beside my hospital bed. He reached out as if to grab my hand, but stopped when he saw the icy warning in my eyes. "You have to believe me. I never wanted any of this. My mother poisoned my mind. She forged those sterility documents while you were deployed. She hired actors to tell me you were being unfaithful overseas. She completely brainwashed me into believing you were a traitor." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with dramatic sobs. "I was weak. Aaliyah," he moaned. "I was so blinded by her lies that I could not see the truth standing right in front of me. She manipulated everything. She forced me to sign those divorce papers. She forced me to file that custody injunction this morning. I never wanted to take Maya away from you. My mother threatened to cut me out of the family if I did not comply." I watched his performance with absolute clinical detachment. It was a masterful display of victimhood. He was taking every ounce of blame and shifting it squarely onto Vivian's shoulders. He was trying to paint himself as a helpless pawn caught in a grand conspiracy. But I knew the truth. Julian was a grown man who had enjoyed every second of watching me suffer. He had basked in the power his mother gave him. Now that the power was shifting, he was desperately trying to rewrite history. Julian looked up, his eyes wide and desperate. "We can fix this," he pleaded, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "We can undo all of this damage right now. I will withdraw the custody petition. I will tell the social workers that my mother fabricated the psychological report. We can get Maya back today. We can go home, Aaliyah. Just the three of us. We can raise our daughter together away from my mother's toxic influence. We can be a real family." He leaned closer, his words dripping with honey and false promises. "You are the only woman I have ever truly loved," he murmured. "I know I messed up, but I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. We do not need the lawyers. We do not need the courts. Just forgive me, Aaliyah. Take me back and let me be a father to our beautiful little girl." The sheer audacity of his proposal hung in the quiet hospital room. He wanted me to call off the war. He wanted me to drop my weapons and walk back into his arms just because he handed me a piece of paper confirming what I already knew. He thought he could erase years of betrayal and humiliation with a tearful apology and a desperate plea for a happy future. What Julian did not understand was that I had already seen the offshore account ledgers. I knew exactly why he was kneeling on the floor begging for reconciliation. He did not care about a happy family. He cared about the $50 million trust fund that had just unlocked the moment that DNA test confirmed his paternity. If I took him back, he would be married to the mother of the sole heir. He would have shared access to the massive fortune. He would be protected from the federal embezzlement charges because a wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband. He was using our infant daughter as a financial shield. I slowly reached out and picked up the white envelope. I did not open it. I simply held it in my hand, feeling the crisp paper against my fingertips. Julian watched my movements with greedy anticipation. He thought his speech had worked. He thought the mention of a united family had softened my resolve. A tiny, triumphant smile briefly touched the corners of his mouth before he forced his expression back into a mask of sorrow. "You are a remarkably terrible actor, Julian," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. His face fell, his eyes widening in genuine shock. "Aaliyah, I swear I'm telling the truth," he stammered, scrambling to his feet. I dropped the envelope back onto the bed. "Do you honestly think I'm going to fall for this?" I asked, tilting my head. "You did not come here because you love me. You did not come here because you suddenly grew a conscience. You came here because your financial monitors just alerted you that someone is currently auditing your mother offshore accounts. You know the $50 million is slipping out of your grasp." Julian took a step backward, his face draining of all color. "I have no idea what you are talking about," he stuttered, his voice rising in panic. "I am here for our daughter." "You are here for a paycheck," I stated flatly. "You let your mother serve me with papers declaring me mentally unfit. You let social workers drag my newborn baby out of my arms just hours ago. You stood by and watched them rip my child away because you thought it would guarantee your control over that trust fund. And now that you realize my security firm is tearing your empire apart, you want to play the victim." "Aaliyah, please," Julian begged, holding his hands up in surrender. "You have to listen to me." "I am done listening to you, Julian," I commanded, leaning forward. "You do not get to walk away clean by blaming Vivian. You are just as corrupt and greedy as she is. You threw me away when you thought I was useless, and now you are begging on your knees because you realize I hold all the power." I opened my laptop screen to full brightness. The reflection of the scrolling data illuminated the sheer terror on his face. "You are going to withdraw the custody petition today," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "But we are not getting back together. We are not being a family. You will never see a single penny of that trust fund. I'm going to let the federal government investigate every single fraud your family has committed." Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He finally realized that his charm and his fake tears were completely useless against me. He had walked into my room expecting to manipulate a broken, heartbroken woman. Instead, he was facing a military commander who was preparing to scorch the earth. "Get out of my room, Julian," I said, pointing at the door. "And tell your mother she better find a very good defense attorney because Operation White Angel has only just begun." He did not say another word. He turned and fled the room, leaving the DNA test sitting on the bed exactly where it belonged. It was nothing but worthless paper to me now. I already knew Maya was mine, and I was going to burn his entire world to ashes to get her back. Except he did not even make it into the hallway. Before the heavy wooden door could swing completely shut behind him, I let out a shattered, gasping sob. Julian froze in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle. I let my shoulders collapse forward, letting my chin drop to my chest. I purposefully dropped the icy tactical commander persona and slipped perfectly into the role of a terrified, broken woman. The tears I forced to the surface were entirely real, but they were fueled by a deep, burning rage rather than sorrow. I let my hands shake violently against the hospital blanket. Julian slowly turned around. He saw me trembling. He saw the exact image of the defeated, vulnerable wife he desperately needed me to be. "I cannot do this anymore, Julian," I whispered, my voice cracking with manufactured despair. "I am so tired. I am so scared of those social workers. Do you really mean it? If I forgive you, will you really help me get Maya back?" Julian's face lit up with a sickening mixture of relief and predatory triumph. He practically ran back to my bedside, dropping heavily onto his knees. He grabbed my shaking hands and pressed them against his chest. "I promise you, Aaliyah," he said, his voice dripping with honey and false devotion, "I will make all of this go away. You just have to trust me. My mother is terrified that you are going to use the baby to steal the $50 million trust fund. She is the one pushing the hospital board to evaluate you. But we can outsmart her. All you have to do is sign a temporary financial waiver." I looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, pretending to be completely overwhelmed. "A waiver?" I asked, letting my voice tremble. "It is just a legal formality," he promised, stroking my knuckles. "Just a proxy document giving me temporary guardianship over Maya financial estate. It proves to my mother that you do not care about the money. The second you sign that paper, I will march down to the social workers and withdraw the custody petition. My mother will back off, and we can take our daughter home today. Just you, me, and Maya. We can finally have the happy future we always wanted." I let out another soft sob, nodding weakly, as if I was completely surrendering to his logic. I told him to give me a few hours to rest. I told him to bring the paperwork back this evening, and I would sign whatever he needed just to hold my daughter again. Julian smiled, a genuine smug smile of pure victory. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to my forehead, completely blinded by his own arrogance. He told me he loved me and that everything was going to be all right. Then he stood up, smoothed his expensive scrubs, and walked out of the room. The absolute second the latch clicked shut, my tears stopped. My face went completely deadpan. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand and immediately pulled my laptop back onto my lap. Julian actually thought I was a naive, emotionally compromised housewife who would sign away $50 million for a fake promise. He thought he had played me perfectly. He had no idea he had just walked directly into a federal surveillance trap. I opened the encrypted communication channel to Marcus. Operation White Angel was already fully integrated into the hospital mainframe. Marcus Guy typed rapidly into the command console. "Access the internal security feeds from the West Wing corridor. Pull the audio and video logs from exactly 20 minutes ago. Filter for Julian and Vivian." The hospital had recently upgraded their entire security infrastructure, installing high-definition cameras with integrated audio sensors in all the VIP corridors. Because my cybersecurity firm managed the federal supply chains for this medical network, I had absolute backdoor access to every single camera in the building. Within seconds, a video file populated on my screen. I clicked play and boosted the audio through my encrypted software. The footage showed the private elevator lobby just down the hall from my room. Vivian was standing there wearing a sharp designer coat, pacing anxiously. Connor was leaning against the wall, checking his luxury watch. The elevator doors opened, and Julian stepped out, looking anxious. "Did you give her the DNA test?" Vivian demanded on the recording, her voice sharp and impatient. "And I am about to," Julian replied, running a hand through his hair. "Are you absolutely sure this is going to work, Mother? She looked ready to kill me earlier. She is a mother who just had her newborn ripped from her arms by the state Connor sneered on the video. She is emotionally shattered, Julian. You just go in there and play the crying, repentant husband. Tell her whatever she wants to hear. Tell her you will run away with her. She will sign the financial release proxy just to get the child back." "And what happens after she signs it?" Julian asked, his voice dropping lower. Vivian let out a cold, vicious laugh that echoed through my laptop speakers. "The moment her signature is on that proxy document, the $50 million trust fund legally transfers to our control," she stated ruthlessly. "And the second the ink is dry, I will have the chief of psychiatry sign the involuntary commitment order. Aaliyah will be locked inside the secure psychiatric ward by midnight. She will be heavily medicated and legally classified as permanently unfit. She will spend the rest of her life in a padded room while we keep the money." "And the baby?" Julian asked. "We will hire a nanny," Connor replied, waving his hand dismissively. "The child is nothing but a $50 million key. We keep the kid quiet, and we keep the money flowing. Now go in there and put on a show, Julian. Our entire future depends on it." I sat in the sterile silence of my hospital room, listening to the recording play out. My husband, my mother-in-law, and their financial lapdog were casually planning to lock me in a psychiatric prison for the rest of my life and treat my beautiful newborn daughter like a piece of banking equipment. They were laughing about it. A cold, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. I did not feel fear. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the absolute focused clarity of a soldier about to call in an airstrike. I isolated the audio file and ran it through a forensic encryption protocol, ensuring the metadata was perfectly preserved and legally admissible in any federal court. I saved it directly to an external drive. This was not just evidence of a smear campaign. This was documented proof of criminal conspiracy, extortion, and medical fraud. I opened the channel to Marcus one last time. "Marcus," I said, my voice harder than steel. "The bait was taken. We have the confession on audio. Operation White Angel is moving to Phase 2. Route this file directly to the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and forward a copy to the Military Judge Advocate General." I looked out the hospital window at the sprawling city skyline. Vivian and Julian thought they were playing a game of high society chess. They were about to find out what happens when you bring a knife to a drone strike. The glowing confirmation on my laptop screen was the only reassurance I needed. The encrypted audio file had safely reached the federal investigators. I closed the computer and let the silence of the hospital room wrap around me. I knew what I had to do next. I had to let them think they were winning. I had to walk right into their trap to spring my own. The next morning, Julian returned to my room. His face was washed pale and he wore a tailored suit instead of scrubs. He held a massive bouquet of white lilies. He set them on the tray table and looked at me with those practiced, sorrowful eyes. He told me he had spoken to his mother. He told me Vivian was willing to call a truce. He said she realized she made a mistake out of fear and wanted to make things right. I sat up in the bed, pulling the thin hospital blanket up to my chest. I asked him what kind of truce he was talking about. He sat on the edge of the mattress and reached for my hand. He told me the annual hospital charity gala was taking place tomorrow night in the grand ballroom of the medical center. It was the most important social event of the year for the elite families of Buckhead. He said Vivian wanted me to attend. He told me she wanted to officially introduce Maya to society and welcome her as the newest member of the bloodline. He squeezed my fingers and leaned closer. He said if I came to the gala and signed the temporary financial proxy in front of the hospital board, Vivian would completely drop the custody petition. He told me the social workers would release Maya from the neonatal ward directly into my arms. He promised we could walk out of that ballroom as a united family. It took every ounce of military discipline I possessed not to laugh in his face. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at that gala. I knew about the psychiatric commitment papers. I knew they planned to force me to sign over the $50 million trust fund and then lock me in a padded cell before the dessert course was even served. But I let my lower lip tremble. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. I looked at him with all the desperate hope of a broken mother. I told him I would do it. I told him I would wear whatever Vivian wanted me to wear, and I would sign whatever documents they put in front of me. I told him I just wanted my baby back. Julian smiled. It was the slick, oily smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He kissed my cheek and told me I was making the right choice. He said he would send his driver to pick me up tomorrow evening. The moment he left the room, I wiped my face and opened my encrypted terminal. I messaged Marcus and told him the target was moving to the grand ballroom. I ordered him to route all the intercepted financial ledgers and medical fraud evidence to the main projection screens in the gala hall. I told him to synchronize the data dump with my signal. Operation White Angel was entering its final phase. Across town in the sprawling Buckhead mansion, Vivian was celebrating her victory. She stood in her massive walk-in closet, holding a custom-tailored emerald green gown against her chest. Jasmine lounged on a velvet chaise, sipping a glass of expensive champagne. Jasmine laughed, setting her crystal glass on a side table. "I cannot believe it actually worked, Mother," she said, her voice dripping with venom. Julian said she folded like a cheap lawn chair. "She actually believes you are going to let her walk out of that gala with the baby." Vivian turned to the mirror, admiring her reflection. "People like Aaliyah are incredibly predictable, Jasmine," she stated coldly. They let their emotions blind them to strategy. She is so desperate to hold that bastard child she is walking straight into her own execution. Vivian walked over to her mahogany vanity and picked up a thick leather folder. Inside were two documents that would secure her empire forever. The first was the financial proxy agreement giving Julian total control over the $50 million grandfather trust. The second was an emergency involuntary psychiatric hold authorized by the chief of medicine. "We have everything perfectly orchestrated," Vivian said, running her manicured fingers over the legal paperwork. "The moment she signs the proxy, the money is ours. Connor has the offshore routing numbers ready to execute the transfer immediately. And the moment the transfer clears, the hospital security team will escort our dear Aaliyah to the secure ward on the 7th floor." Jasmine smiled a vicious, greedy smile. "What about the baby?" she asked. Vivian waved her hand dismissively. "We will parade the child around for a few photographs to satisfy the board," she replied. "Then the nanny will take her back to the nursery. In a few months, we will send the child to a private boarding facility in Switzerland. We will never have to look at her again." They laughed together, a cruel, synchronized sound that echoed off the marble floors of the mansion. They believed they were untouchable. They believed their elite status and their stolen wealth made them immune to consequence. They had no idea they were walking into a federal snare. The next evening arrived with the heavy, humid air of a southern summer. I stood in front of the mirror in my hospital room, slipping into the dress Julian had sent for me. It was a simple, elegant black gown. It was the kind of dress meant to make me look subdued and compliant. I pulled my hair back into a severe knot. I did not wear any jewelry. I looked exactly like a woman who had been completely defeated. My phone buzzed on the tray table. It was a message from Marcus. The federal agents were in position. The digital projection system in the ballroom was fully under our control. The trap was set. I walked down the quiet hospital corridor toward the private elevator. The doors opened, and Julian stood waiting for me. He wore a sharp black tuxedo and a bright, enthusiastic smile. He held his arm out to me, playing the part of the devoted husband perfectly. "You look beautiful, Aaliyah," he murmured as I stepped into the elevator. "Tonight is going to be the start of our new life. I promise you." I did not answer him. I simply kept my eyes fixed on the descending floor numbers. We walked out into the hospital lobby and toward the grand ballroom. I could hear the murmur of hundreds of wealthy guests and the soft playing of a string quartet. This was Vivian Kingdom. This was the place where she wielded her power and destroyed her enemies. Julian pushed open the heavy oak doors and led me inside. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in golden light. Tables were draped in white silk and covered in massive floral arrangements. The absolute elite of the city were gathered there wearing diamonds and tailored suits, sipping champagne and exchanging corporate secrets. And standing at the center of it all was Vivian. She looked like a queen holding court. She wore her emerald gown and a necklace of glittering diamonds. Jasmine and Connor stood flanking her, projecting the image of a flawless, powerful dynasty. Vivian saw us approach. A terrifyingly predatory smile spread across her face. She raised her glass and gestured for the room to quiet down. The string quartet stopped playing. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Julian and me as we walked across the marble floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivian announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Tonight is a very special evening for our family. Tonight we officially welcome a new generation." A side door opened and a nurse in a crisp uniform walked out carrying Maya. My heart seized in my chest at the sight of my daughter. She was wrapped in a delicate white blanket, sleeping peacefully despite the crowd. The nurse brought her to Vivian, who took the baby with stiff, awkward movements, holding her up for the guests to see. Polite applause rippled through the room. Julian squeezed my arm tightly, silently urging me to play my part. Vivian handed the baby back to the nurse and turned her predatory gaze entirely on me. She walked over to a small table near the podium where the leather folder rested. "Aaliyah, dear," Vivian said, her voice dripping with fake affection. "We are so glad you could join us. We know you have been struggling immensely since the birth." But tonight we move forward together. Julian has the paperwork ready. Once we finalize the trust arrangements, we can truly focus on your recovery. Julian picked up a silver pen and held it out to me. He pointed to the dotted line on the financial proxy document. Just sign it, Aaliyah, he whispered urgently. Sign it and we can go get Maya. I looked at the pen. I looked at Julian, pleading lying eyes. I looked at Vivian, who was practically vibrating with greed. I looked at Connor, who stood near the exit, signaling to the hospital security guards waiting in the shadows. They were all in position. They were ready to lock me away and steal my life. I reached out and took the silver pen from Julian's hand. I held it over the thick, expensive paper. The entire ballroom was dead silent, watching the dramatic family moment unfold. Vivian let out a soft, breathless sigh of anticipation. I did not sign the paper. I dropped the pen onto the table. The sharp clatter of silver against wood echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. I looked directly into Vivian's eyes and let the mask of the terrified, broken woman completely fall away. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. I looked at her with the cold, calculated authority of a military commander. I am not signing anything, Vivian, I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong. Julian grabbed my arm, panic instantly flooding his face. Aaliyah, what are you doing? He hissed. You promised. I ripped my arm out of his grasp. I promised I would show up, Julian, I stated coldly. I never promised I would surrender. Vivian's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. She snapped her fingers, signaling the security guards waiting by the doors. This woman is having a severe psychological episode, Vivian shouted to the crowd, playing her final desperate card. She is unstable and dangerous. Guards restrain her and escort her to the psychiatric ward immediately. The heavy-set guards moved forward, reaching for their restraints. The wealthy guests gasped and stepped back, giving them a wide berth. But before the guards could take another step, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I pressed the single red button on the screen. Operation White Angel was unleashed. Every single massive projection screen in the grand ballroom instantly flickered to life. The elegant slideshow of hospital charity work vanished. It was replaced by high-definition internal security footage from the hospital corridor. The audio blasted through the state-of-the-art sound system, drowning out the gasps of the crowd. It was the recording. It was Vivian, Connor, and Julian standing in the hallway laughing about their plan. The sound of Vivian's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The moment her signature is on that proxy document, the $50 million trust fund legally transfers to our control. And the second the ink is dry, I will have the chief of psychiatry sign the involuntary commitment order. She will spend the rest of her life in a padded room while we keep the money. The entire ballroom froze in absolute horrified shock. The elite guests stared at the screens, their mouths hanging open, as they listened to the beloved charity host confess to a massive criminal conspiracy. Vivian's face drained of all color. She looked like a ghost staring at the screens in pure, unadulterated terror. Connor stumbled backward, bumping into a table and sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor. "Turn it off!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Turn those screens off right now!" But the recording kept playing. Next came Connor's voice detailing the offshore accounts and the fraudulent wire transfers. Then came the undeniable proof that Julian knew everything and was playing me for a fool. The security guards who had been advancing toward me stopped dead in their tracks, looking from the screens to Vivian in total confusion. I stepped forward, walking right up to Vivian. She was trembling violently, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. "I told you I was coming for everything, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying through the silent, stunned room. "You thought you could use your money and your power to steal my daughter and lock me away. You thought you owned this grid, but you forgot one very important detail." I leaned in closer, looking deep into her terrified eyes. "I built the grid." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. It was not hospital security. It was a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with letters printed across their backs. They fanned out across the room, moving with swift military precision. "Nobody move," the lead agent shouted, holding up a federal warrant. Vivian, Connor, and Julian, You are all under arrest for federal embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and medical fraud. The screaming started immediately. Jasmine collapsed onto the floor, wailing in hysterics. Connor tried to run for a side exit, but two agents tackled him to the marble floor, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Julian dropped to his knees, crying and begging for mercy, his carefully constructed life completely destroyed. Vivian stood frozen as an agent approached her and pulled her arms behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked loudly in the quiet room. She looked at me, her eyes filled with absolute venom and total defeat. I did not look at her anymore. I turned and walked straight toward the nurse who was still holding Maya. The nurse looked terrified, but she gently handed my daughter into my arms. I held Maya tightly against my chest, feeling her warm, steady heartbeat against mine. The $50 million trust fund, the elite status, the mansions, and the power, none of it mattered to me. I had protected my bloodline. I had burned a corrupt empire to the ground to keep my daughter safe. I walked out of the grand ballroom holding Maya close, stepping over the shattered crystal and the ruined lives of the people who tried to destroy me. I walked out into the warm southern night, finally free and entirely victorious. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Medical Center was transformed into a glittering display of absolute wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the city elite. Men in expensive custom tuxedos and women draped in designer silk and heavy diamonds mingled around tables covered in white orchids and imported roses. The mayor of Atlanta stood near a towering ice sculpture, laughing loudly at a joke made by the chief of surgery. Members of the hospital board were clustered near the open bar, clinking champagne flutes and discussing the evening silent auction. It was exactly the kind of high society event where reputations were cemented and massive fortunes were quietly transferred behind closed doors. I stood in the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains, watching the room pulse with power and arrogance. Julian had left my side moments ago to join his mother near the main stage. He looked nervous, constantly pulling at his collar, but he masked his anxiety with his typical practice smile. Jasmine was floating through the crowd, wearing a stunning crimson gown, stopping to kiss cheeks and whisper gossip to the wives of the board members. She looked my way once, and her lips curled into a cruel, satisfied sneer. She thought she was watching a defeated woman, taking her final breath in polite society. She thought this was the end of my story. Vivian was entirely in her element. She moved through the ballroom like a monarch inspecting her kingdom. She wore a breathtaking emerald gown that caught the light with every confident step she took. Her neck was adorned with diamonds that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. She stopped to shake hands with the mayor, offering him that flawless, benevolent smile she had perfected over decades of manipulation. She was shaking hands and accepting compliments while secretly holding the paperwork that would lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost mesmerizing to witness. Connor stood a few feet behind Vivian, holding a sleek black leather portfolio against his chest. I knew exactly what was inside that portfolio. It held the proxy documents giving Julian total control of the $50 million trust fund and the involuntary commitment forms waiting for my coerced signature. Connor scanned the room with the cold eyes of a predator, making sure the hospital security guards were stationed at every exit. They had turned this beautiful charity gala into a heavily guarded trap. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the guests to take their seats. The murmurs died down as hundreds of people moved toward the lavishly decorated tables. I remained standing near the back wall, my face an unreadable mask. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. I did not feel the panic they expected me to feel. I only felt the icy precision of a tactician watching an enemy walk willingly into the crosshairs. Vivian stepped up to the clear acrylic podium at the front of the room. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. A respectful hush fell over the grand ballroom. Everyone respected Vivian. Everyone believed she was a pillar of the Atlanta community, a grieving mother-in-law trying to hold her family together during a difficult time. Thank you all for coming tonight. Vivian began, her voice resonating with perfect practiced emotion. She paused, taking a slow breath and looking down at her hands as if gathering her strength. We are gathered here to raise funds for the pediatric wing of this incredible hospital. As many of you know, this cause has recently become deeply personal to my family. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the table where the mayor and the hospital board sat. She offered them a brave, watery smile. A few women in the audience let out sympathetic sighs. Just days ago, my son Julian welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world. Vivian continued, her voice trembling slightly. My granddaughter Maya is a beacon of hope for our family. We are overjoyed to introduce her to all of you tonight. She is the future of our legacy. The crowd erupted into polite, warm applause. Julian stood up at his table and gave a modest wave, playing the role of the proud new father. I watched my husband soak in the admiration of the city elite, knowing he had just signed custody papers, trying to declare me an unfit mother. Vivian held up a hand, signaling for quiet. Her expression shifted from joy to a carefully constructed mask of profound sorrow. But this joyous occasion has been shadowed by a terrible tragedy, she said, her voice dropping to a somber whisper. As some of you may have heard, Maya, mother Ayalea, has been struggling deeply since the birth. The trauma of her past military deployments combined with severe postpartum complications has left her in a fragile and unstable state. The ballroom was dead silent now. Every eye was fixed on Vivian. I stood in the back listening to her spin her web of lies to the most powerful people in Atlanta. She was setting the stage. She was establishing the narrative that I was dangerous and broken, so that when hospital security dragged me away in restraints, the board would simply nod in tragic understanding. We have tried everything to help her, Vivian lied, looking out at the crowd with fake tears glistening in her eyes. We brought her the best doctors. We offered her our home. But sometimes love is not enough to heal a broken mind. It breaks my heart to stand before you tonight and announce that Ayalea will be transferring to a long-term psychiatric treatment facility this evening. It is the only way to ensure her safety and the safety of my precious granddaughter. Jasmine dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief sitting at the front table. The mayor shook his head in solemn sympathy. The members of the hospital board exchanged grave looks, silently approving of Vivian's decisive action to protect the child. It was a masterclass in public manipulation. She was destroying my entire life and making the city applaud her for it. Julian will be assuming full primary custody of Maya, Vivian announced, her voice regaining its strength and absolute authority. He will be taking over the family trust to ensure Maya has the future she deserves. Ayalea has agreed to sign over all proxy rights tonight before she begins her treatment. We ask for your prayers and your privacy as our family navigates this incredibly difficult transition. She stepped back from the podium, wiping a single stray tear from her cheek. The applause that followed was deafening. It was the sound of high society rewarding a woman for her bravery and sacrifice. They were clapping for a monster. Connor stepped up to the edge of the stage, opening the black leather portfolio. Julian stood up and looked toward the back of the room where I was standing. He gestured for me to come forward, his eyes cold and demanding. The trap was fully sprung. The entire ballroom turned in their seats to look at me, the tragic, unstable mother who was about to sign away her child and her freedom. I did not move immediately. I let the silence stretch. I let them stare. Vivian stood on the stage looking down at me with absolute triumphant superiority. She thought she had won. She thought she had boxed me into a corner where I had no choice but to surrender in front of the mayor and the entire hospital board. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked at the heavy doors of the ballroom where my own security team was waiting out of sight. I looked at the massive digital projection screens mounted behind the stage currently displaying the charity logo. I thought about the hacked audio recordings sitting on my servers ready to deploy. I took my first step forward, walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted slightly, whispering to each other as I passed. I kept my head high and my eyes locked dead onto Vivian. I was not walking toward my execution. I was walking toward hers. Vivian stood at the clear acrylic podium, basking in the adoration of the room. She opened her mouth to deliver the final killing blow to my reputation when the heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. The loud thud echoed against the crystal chandeliers, causing the murmuring crowd to fall into a dead silence. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold, but I was not wearing the pathetic black gown Julian had sent me. I was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal power suit, perfectly tailored and projecting absolute authority. My hair was pulled back tight, and my expression was forged from pure steel. I did not have Maya in my arms. I did not look like a broken, weeping mother begging for her child. I looked like a federal executioner. Flanking me on either side were two men in dark suits. They were not hospital security. They were undercover Federal Bureau of Investigation agents with their badges clipped to their belts. Walking a half step behind me was a top government attorney for the Department of Justice. The sheer presence of our group sucked the air right out of the room. The elite high society guests of Atlanta held their collective breath instinctively, parting like the Red Sea as we began to walk down the center aisle. Connor was the first to realize that their entire flawless plan was disintegrating before his eyes. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. He fumbled frantically for his earpiece and began whispering orders to the hospital security team stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. I watched him desperately waving his hands, signaling for the guards to intercept me before I could reach the stage. 4 large men in hospital uniforms stepped into the aisle to block my path. They did not even get within 10 feet of me. The federal agent on my right simply reached into his jacket and held up his badge. "Stand down and clear the aisle." The agent commanded, his voice slicing through the quiet room with absolute authority. "This is a federal investigation, and any interference will be treated as obstruction of justice." The hospital security guards froze, looking at the federal badge, and then looking back at Connor in sheer panic. They immediately stepped aside, lowering their heads and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Connor staggered backward, knocking into a linen-covered table and sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the marble floor. Up on the stage, Vivian looked down at me, her perfect, benevolent smile freezing on her face. Her hands gripped the edges of the acrylic podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. Julian was standing near the front table, looking completely paralyzed. He stared at my power suit and the federal agents beside me, his mind clearly struggling to comprehend how the weak, hysterical wife he had left in the hospital room just hours ago was now marching toward him with the full weight of the United States government behind her. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of the stage, looking up at the woman who had tried to steal my daughter and lock me in a psychiatric ward. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. The mayor, the hospital board members, and the wealthiest families in the city were staring at us in absolute shock. They had come to celebrate a charity milestone and watch a tragic family transition. Instead, they were witnessing a federal takedown. "Good evening, Vivian," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying effortlessly across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "I apologize for interrupting your beautiful speech, but we have some pressing legal matters to attend to regarding the Hospital Charity Foundation and the $50 million Grandfather Trust." Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat worked convulsively as she looked at the government attorney standing beside me. The attorney stepped forward and unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulling out a thick stack of federal warrants. "Vivian Blackwood," the attorney announced, his voice booming through the ballroom. "We have a federal injunction to immediately freeze all assets tied to your charity foundation. We also have warrants for the immediate seizure of all hospital financial records and offshore routing data coordinated by your financial director, Connor." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp from her seat at the front table, dropping her crystal glass. Julian finally snapped out of his paralysis and took a step toward me, holding his hands up defensively. "Ah, Leah, what are you doing?" he whispered frantically. "You are ruining everything. Where is the baby? Why are you doing this?" I turned my gaze to my pathetic excuse for a husband. "Maya is perfectly safe," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet tone. She is resting comfortably in a private suite upstairs, surrounded by my personal security detail. You really thought I would bring my daughter into a room full of criminals, Julian? You thought I would hand her over so you could ship her off to a boarding school in Switzerland, while you stole $50 million? Julian stumbled backward, shaking his head in denial. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, looking around at the shocked faces of the hospital board. Mother, tell them she is crazy. Tell them she is having a breakdown. Vivian finally found her voice. She gripped the microphone and tried to project her usual commanding tone, but it trembled with unmistakable terror. This is an outrage, Vivian declared, pointing a shaking finger at me. Security, remove this woman immediately. She is a psychiatric patient. She is highly unstable, and she is disturbing a private charity event. I did not even blink. I turned to the agent beside me and nodded my head once. The agent pulled out an encrypted tablet and tapped the screen, bypassing the hospital audio-visual network in less than a second. You are absolutely right, Vivian, I said, looking up at her with a cold smile. The guests deserve to know the truth about my mental state. Let us show them exactly how unstable I really am. Let us show them the real reason you wanted me locked inside a padded cell tonight. I stepped past Vivian, who was frozen in shock, and took the microphone right out of her trembling hand. The federal agents flanked the stage, making sure no one interfered. I looked out at the sea of faces, the wealthy elite of Atlanta who had just been clapping for my imprisonment. I turned to the projection screens behind me and gave a nod to the agent holding the tablet. The screens flickered and the image of the charity logo vanished. It was replaced by high-resolution scans of medical documents bearing the logo of the Atlanta Fertility Institute. For the past 2 years, Vivian has been telling everyone that my husband and I were struggling to conceive. I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the ballroom. She told her friends, her board members, and eventually the press, that the trauma of my military service had left me broken and unable to provide an heir to the prestigious bloodline. I gestured to the screens behind me, but like everything else in Vivian life, that was a carefully calculated lie. What you are looking at are Julian actual medical records from the fertility clinic. The real records. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Julian. He took a step toward the screen, his eyes wide with confusion. When we went to the clinic for testing, we were told that Julian had a severe medical condition. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. We were told he was completely infertile. It devastated our marriage. It broke my husband's heart. And when I miraculously got pregnant against all medical odds, it planted a seed of doubt that almost destroyed us. Julian believed I had betrayed him because the doctors told him he could never be a father. I turned slowly to face Vivian. She looked like she was going to be sick. Her perfect posture was gone, and she was gripping the podium just to stay upright. But Julian was never infertile. I stated the truth, echoing off the high ceilings. He was perfectly healthy. The screen shifted to a new document. It was a bank transfer ledger showing a wire payment of $500,000 from one of Vivian offshore accounts directly to the chief of medicine at the fertility clinic. Right beside it was an intercepted email from Vivian to the doctor. I read the email out loud for the entire ballroom to hear. Swap the lab results. Tell my son he is sterile. I want this marriage destroyed by the end of the year. I will not have a working-class military grunt inheriting my family legacy. Break them apart. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. Women covered their mouths in horror. The mayor looked physically sick, stepping away from the stage as if Vivian had a contagious disease. I looked at Julian. He was staring at the massive screen, his mouth hanging open. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his expensive tuxedo. His entire reality, his entire understanding of his marriage and his struggle and his child was shattering in real time. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room. "Mother, what did you do?" Vivian reached out a shaking hand toward him. "Julian, darling, please, you have to understand," she stammered, her voice pleading and desperate. "I did it for you. I did it to protect you from her. She was going to drag you down. I just wanted you to marry someone appropriate, someone who understood our world." You paid a doctor to tell me I was broken, Julian shouted, the anger suddenly exploding out of him. His voice echoed through the ballroom, raw and devastated. You let me believe my own wife cheated on me. You let me look at my newborn daughter and doubt if she was even mine. Vivian shook her head violently, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. It was for the family, Julian. It was all for the family. Julian let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. His knees buckled beneath him and he collapsed right there on the polished hardwood floor of the stage. He fell to his hands and knees, his custom tuxedo gathering dust as he stared up at his mother in absolute, unadulterated horror. He realized in that exact moment that the monster he had helped create to destroy me had been destroying him all along. Jasmine was backing away toward the exit, her face pale with terror. Connor was already in handcuffs near the back doors, surrounded by federal agents. The mighty empire they had built on lies and manipulation was burning to the ground, and I was holding the match. I stood over Julian, looking down at the man who had agreed to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to get his hands on $50 million. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. He had made his choice. You wanted me committed, Vivian, I said, turning back to the broken matriarch. You wanted to stand up here and tell the city I was a danger to myself and my child. But the only dangerous person in this room is the woman who would pay $500,000 to traumatize her own son just to get rid of a daughter-in-law she did not like. The federal agents moved onto the stage. They did not ask for permission. They grabbed Vivian by the arms, pulling her away from the podium. The cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly over the silent, terrified crowd. The cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly over the silent, terrified crowd. Connor watched the steel rings lock around Vivian's wrists and finally broke out of his frozen stupor. His face turned a violent shade of crimson as the reality of his own impending arrest set in. Cut the power, he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. He lunged toward the audio-visual control panel at the side of the stage, knocking over a towering floral arrangement. Somebody cut the main breaker. Right now, turn those screens off. I did not even turn my head to acknowledge his panic. I simply pressed another button on my encrypted tablet. The audio system roared back to life, sending a low bass hum vibrating through the floorboards of the grand ballroom. You cannot cut the power, Connor, I said, my voice projecting effortlessly over his frantic shouting. The entire hospital grid has been locked down from the outside. I turned my attention away from the sobbing Vivian and looked directly at the hospital board members sitting in the front row. They were staring at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. The mayor had abandoned his champagne glass and was gripping the edge of his table, his jaw clenched in fury. For the past 2 years, Vivian has painted me as a fragile military wife who could not handle the pressures of high society civilian life, I told the room, walking slowly across the front of the stage. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood, demanding the attention of every single elite guest in the ballroom. She told you I was a pathetic charity case holding back her brilliant son. She told you I was losing my mind. But what Vivian did not know, and what Julian never bothered to ask during our entire marriage, is what I actually do for a living. I paused, letting the tension build in the heavy, humid air. 8 months ago, the hospital board recognized severe anomalies in the internal financial ledgers. I continued, my voice echoing perfectly through the massive space. The board secretly contracted an independent forensic auditing firm to investigate the entire hospital network from the inside out. They needed someone invisible, someone who could infiltrate the system without triggering any alarms from the executive staff. A loud collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the pieces began to click together in their minds. That firm belongs to me, I announced. I am the lead forensic auditor. And I have spent the last 8 months mapping every single fraudulent transaction this family has ever made. Connor let out an animalistic yell and tried to rush me, attempting to snatch the microphone from my hand. He did not make it 2 feet. The second federal agent stepped forward and slammed him face first into the acrylic podium, pinning his arms tightly behind his back. Connor thrashed and cursed, but the agent held him down with effortless military precision. I pointed to the massive projection screens illuminating the ballroom. The medical clinic bribe was just the beginning of the rot. I stated, my voice hard and unforgiving. Look at the screen, ladies and gentlemen. Look at what your beloved charity host has been doing with your generous donations. The display shifted instantly. The medical records vanished and were replaced by intricate financial webs mapping thousands of bank transfers. Glowing red lines traced millions of dollars flowing out of the hospital accounts and funneling directly into offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the Swiss Alps. This is the Pediatric Cancer Fund, I explained, pointing to the largest red graphic on the board. The very fund you are all sitting here tonight wearing your diamonds and writing blank checks to support. Over the past 4 years, Vivian and her loyal chief financial officer, Connor, have systematically drained $15 million from the accounts meant to save dying children. The elite crowd erupted. The polite silence was completely shattered by voices shouting in pure outrage. Wealthy donors stood up from their tables, pointing angrily at the stage. The wives of the board members who had been kissing Vivian cheeks just an hour ago were now looking at her with absolute disgust and revulsion. The screen shifted again, displaying a rapid montage of undeniable photographic proof. There were high-definition images of a sprawling luxury estate in the south of France. There were purchase orders for custom-built supercars imported directly from Italy. There were receipts for massive diamond necklaces and exclusive country club memberships, all funded directly by the stolen pediatric cancer money. "You bought sports cars with the money meant for chemotherapy," I shouted, staring down at Connor, who was still struggling uselessly against the agent pinning him down. "You bought mansions on the Riviera with the funds meant to keep the neonatal intensive care ward running. You wrapped yourself in emeralds and paraded around Atlanta playing the benevolent saint while you bled this hospital dry." Vivian was shaking her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. "It is a lie," she sobbed, struggling against the handcuffs binding her wrists. "She is making it all up. It is a deep fake." The federal agent holding her gave her arms a sharp tug, forcing her to stand still. "Every single wire transfer carries your digital signature." "Vivian," I replied, my voice echoing with finality. "Every offshore account is tied directly to your personal biometric data. I did not just find the money. I found the internal communications between you and Connor, laughing about how easy it was to steal from sick children, because the board trusted you too much to ever look closely." The mayor of Atlanta stood up, pushing his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at the stage. "You sicken me, Vivian," he shouted over the noise of the crowd. "You sicken this entire city." The outrage in the room reached a fever pitch. The glittering grand ballroom had turned into a tribunal of furious, betrayed elites. Vivian's legacy was entirely destroyed, burned to ash in front of the very people she had manipulated for decades. She slumped forward, defeated and completely broken. Vivian thrashed against the grip of the federal agents, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the polished wood of the stage. The illusion of the grand matriarch was completely shattered. She looked wild, her eyes darting around the room, looking for a single ally among the hundreds of wealthy guests who were now staring at her with pure revulsion. When she realized no one was going to help her, she fixated her venomous glare entirely on me. "You cannot do this to me!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking and echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. "I am a Blackwood. I built this hospital. You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You are nothing but a common street rat. I demand custody of my granddaughter. You hear me? You are an unfit mother, and I will spend my last breath fighting you in family court. Maya belongs to this family." She was hyperventilating, practically foaming at the mouth as the agents held her back. Julian was still kneeling on the floor too, paralyzed by the shock of his own medical records, to even look up at his mother. Jasmine was pressed against the back wall, weeping hysterically, as an agent read her Miranda rights. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into the leather briefcase the Department of Justice attorney was holding and pulled out a thick, bound dossier. I walked over to the exact table where Connor had placed the fraudulent proxy documents just minutes earlier. I lifted my dossier and slammed it down onto the marble tabletop. The heavy thud cracked like a gunshot in the silent room. "You do not have a family court to go to." "Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming. "And you certainly do not have a family to give my daughter to." I opened the dossier. The cameras from the projection booth caught the documents and broadcast them onto the massive screens behind the stage. "This is the Grand Blackwood $50 million trust fund," I announced, looking out at the stunned crowd. The very same trust fund Vivian and Julian were trying to force me to sign over tonight. But what Vivian failed to realize in her arrogance is that my grandfather-in-law was a very cautious man. He wrote a specific ironclad clause into the foundation of this trust. It states that the moment a biological heir is born, the mother of that child becomes the sole legal guardian and controlling proxy of the entire fortune until the child turns 21. Vivian stopped struggling. Her face went entirely slack as she stared at the glowing documents on the screens. "Maya was legally registered with the state this morning." I continued, letting every word sink into Vivian's mind like a poison dart. "I am her sole legal guardian, which means as of 8 o'clock this morning, I became the absolute controlling entity of the Blackwood Trust. I own it all, Vivian. Every single cent." Julian slowly raised his head from the floor, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "Aaliyah, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We have nothing else." "You have exactly what you deserve, Julian," I replied, looking down at him with utter disgust. "But the $50 million is only half the story." I turned back to Vivian, who was breathing in shallow, panicked gasps. As the controlling proxy of the trust and the lead forensic auditor of this hospital, I had the legal authority to trigger an immediate Federal Reserve investigation into the cross-collateralized assets of the Blackwood estate. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, leaning in close so she could hear every syllable clearly. "Do you know what happens when the Federal Reserve opens a fraud and embezzlement investigation into a pediatric cancer fund?" Vivian, I asked softly. "They freeze everything. And I mean everything." The government attorney stepped forward, his voice booming across the ballroom to confirm my statement. "As of 1 hour ago, all Blackwood family assets have been seized by the federal government pending a full criminal audit. This includes the primary estate in Buckhead, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the investment portfolios, and all personal checking accounts belonging to Vivian, Julian, Jasmine, and Connor." Vivian's legs gave out. If the two federal agents had not been holding her up by her arms, she would have collapsed onto the stage right next to her pathetic son. "You have nothing," I told her, my voice echoing through the dead, silent ballroom. "The credit cards in your designer purse are currently declining. The keys to your sports cars have been confiscated by the agents outside. The massive mansion you left this evening is currently being raided by the FBI. You cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone hire an attorney to fight me in family court." The sheer absolute devastation on Vivian's face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The arrogant, untouchable queen of Atlanta high society had been stripped of her crown, her kingdom, and her wealth in less than 10 minutes. She was suddenly just a criminal in a stolen emerald gown waiting to be locked in a federal prison cell. The elite crowd began to murmur, their voices rising in a wave of righteous anger and morbid fascination. The mayor signaled to his own security detail to clear a path out of the room, wanting nothing to do with the toxic fallout of the Blackwood dynasty. The hospital board members were already frantically pulling out their phones, calling their own lawyers to distance themselves from Vivian Charity Foundation. "You ruined us!" Jasmine wailed from the back of the room as an agent clicked handcuffs onto her wrists. "You ruined our entire lives." I looked back at Jasmine, who was sobbing uncontrollably, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You ruined yourselves, Jasmine," I replied coldly. "You built an empire on the backs of dying children and tried to use my daughter as a pawn to protect your stolen wealth." I just turned on the lights. I looked down at Julian one last time. He was curled on the floor, weeping into his hands, a broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to force me into a psychiatric ward. He had traded his soul for his mother approval, and now they were both going to rot in federal prison with absolutely nothing to their names. "Take them away," the government attorney ordered, nodding to the federal agents. The agents hauled Vivian backward. She did not fight anymore. All the fight had been completely drained out of her the moment she realized she was penniless. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, staring at the $50 million trust dossier resting on the marble table. She was dragged down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, past the glaring, disgusted faces of the people she had manipulated for years. Julian was pulled up from the floor by two more agents, his legs stumbling as they marched him out behind his mother. Connor and Jasmine followed a miserable parade of ruined elites walking out of the glittering ballroom and into the flashing red and blue lights of the dozens of federal cruisers waiting outside the hospital. I stood on the stage, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool air conditioning. The suffocating weight of the Blackwood family that had pressed down on my chest for 2 years was finally gone. I was free. My daughter was safe. And the people who had tried to destroy my mind and steal my child were utterly annihilated. I picked up the trust fund dossier from the table and handed it to the government attorney. "Thank you for your assistance tonight," I said, my voice steady and professional. "It was an honor to help take down this network," the attorney replied, offering a respectful nod. "Your forensic work was flawless. They will never see the outside of a cell again." I turned and walked off the stage, ignoring the whispers and stares of the remaining guests. I did not care about their high society politics or their sudden respect for my authority. I only cared about getting upstairs to the private secure suite where my team was waiting. I walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the shattered remnants of the Blackwood legacy behind me. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, my heart feeling lighter with every passing second. The doors opened and I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the heavily guarded suite. Two of my own private security contractors nodded respectfully as I approached, opening the heavy oak door for me. I stepped inside the warm, quiet room. A trusted neonatal nurse I had hired personally was sitting in a rocking chair holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft pink blanket. I walked over and the nurse gently transferred Maya into my arms. I looked down at my beautiful, perfect daughter. She was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. She was completely unaware of the war that had just been fought and won for her future. "We are going home, Maya," I whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her warm forehead. "We are finally going home." I held Maya securely against my chest, letting her steady breathing calm the remaining adrenaline in my veins. The neonatal nurse grabbed the diaper bag and followed me out of the secure suite. We walked down the quiet corridor toward the glass elevators that overlooked the main hospital atrium. As the elevator began its slow descent, the entire grand hall came into view. The wealthy elite guests from the charity gala had poured out of the ballroom and were now clustered in the massive lobby. They were not leaving. They were completely captivated by the scene unfolding in the center of the marble floor. The federal transport vans were still securing the outer perimeter, so the agents had halted their prisoners right in the middle of the atrium. I stepped out of the elevator, and the sound of my shoes hitting the floor caused a ripple of silence to spread through the crowd. The wealthy socialites and powerful executives parted instantly to create a wide, clear path for me. They did not look at me with condescension or pity anymore. They stared at me in absolute terror and unspoken awe. They finally understood the terrifying extent of my power. I walked slowly toward the exit, my head held high with Maya sleeping safely in my arms. Right in my path, the federal agents had forced Connor and Vivian to their knees. A senior FBI agent stood directly in front of them, his voice booming through the echoing hall as he officially read them their Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent." He recited the words, striking like heavy stones against the broken matriarch. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The cold click of another set of heavy metal handcuffs echoed sharply over the quiet crowd, as an agent secured Vivian ankles for transport. She was entirely unrecognizable, staring blankly at the floor, with her flawless makeup ruined by hours of hysterical crying. Jasmine was seated on a nearby bench surrounded by two female officers. When she saw me approaching the main doors, she lost whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left. She ripped herself away from the officers and threw herself onto the marble floor. She crawled toward me, wailing hysterically and completely abandoning any sense of dignity. "Aaliyah, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking as she reached out a shaking hand toward my shoes. "Please, I am begging you. Have mercy on me." I did not know how bad it was. Vivian forced me to do it. "I have nothing left. Please do not let them take me to prison." The federal officers quickly grabbed her by the arms, hauling her back to her feet as she thrashed and kicked. Her desperate screams echoed off the glass walls of the hospital. I paused and looked at her. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness or betrayal. I felt absolutely nothing. "You had a choice, Jasmine," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, carrying across the silent lobby for every elite guest to hear. "You chose to help them steal from dying children. You chose to help them try to lock me in a cage and take my daughter. Mercy is for people who make mistakes. You made a calculated business decision, and now you have to pay the invoice." Jasmine let out a guttural shriek as the agents dragged her through the automatic sliding doors and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the transport vehicles. Connor and Vivian were pulled to their feet and marched out right behind her, their heads bowed in absolute ultimate defeat. Julian walked last, his eyes hollow and empty, not even attempting to look at me or the daughter he had tried to give away. The doors closed behind them, sealing their fate. The grand hall was deadly silent. The richest and most powerful people in Atlanta stood frozen, watching me. I adjusted the soft pink blanket around Maya, making sure she was warm. The government attorney walked up beside me and gave a respectful nod. "The hospital board will be begging you to take over the financial restructuring by tomorrow morning," he stated quietly. I looked around at the terrified elites, the board members who were already bowing their heads in submission as I made eye contact with them. They knew exactly who was in charge now. They knew the Blackwood dynasty was dead, and a new era had begun. I smiled a cold, small smile that made the mayor visibly shudder and take a step backward. "Let them beg," I replied, turning my back on the ashes of the Blackwood Empire. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the hospital and the past behind me forever. I held Maya close to my chest as my security team escorted us out of the private suite and into the glass elevator. The descent down to the main lobby felt like a victory lap. The hospital was swarming with federal agents and local police securing the perimeter and processing the remnants of the Blackwood Empire. As the elevator doors slid open, the chaotic noise of the lobby washed over us. Officers were directing confused charity guests toward the exits, while accountants and lawyers were already seizing hospital hard drives. We walked across the vast marble floor toward the main entrance where a fleet of vehicles was waiting. That was when Julian saw us. He was standing near the front security desk, flanked by two federal agents waiting to be transported. His tuxedo was ruined, covered in dust and wrinkled from his collapse on the stage. His face was a swollen mask of absolute despair. When his eyes locked onto me and the pink blanket bundled in my arms, something inside him completely snapped. "Aaliyah, wait!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. He shoved past the agents before they could react and sprinted across the lobby toward me. My private security detail instantly stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a single hand. I wanted to hear what he had to say. I wanted him to fully understand the permanence of his destruction. Julian crashed to the floor right in front of me. He dropped heavy to his knees on the polished marble, sliding forward until he was right at my feet. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my charcoal powersuit jacket, clutching the fabric like it was his only lifeline. Tears were streaming down his face, dripping off his chin and staining the floor. "Please, Aaliyah," he sobbed, looking up at me with red-rimmed, panicked eyes. Please do not do this. Let me see her. Let me see my daughter. I am begging you. I did not know any of this was happening. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had promised to love and protect me. The man who had instead chosen to lock me in a padded cell to steal my child and my dignity. It was my mother, Julian cried, desperately tugging at my jacket. It was Vivian and Connor. They manipulated me, Aaliyah. They fed me lies and told me you were sick. They hid the money, they faked the records. I am a victim too. I did not want any of this. Please, you have to believe me. I was just trying to do what was best for our family. I looked at his tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. The love I once had for him was entirely dead, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I smoothly stepped back, pulling the hem of my jacket out of his desperate grip. He stumbled forward, catching himself on his hands as he looked up at me in shock. "You are a doctor who couldn't even read his own medical file," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register that carried effortlessly in the silent lobby. "You are not your mother's victim, Julian. You are just a coward." He let out a choked gasp, shaking his head in denial. But I was not finished. "You chose to believe her over your own wife?" I continued, staring directly into his hollow eyes. "You chose the easy path of inherited wealth over the hard work of building a real family. You are a weak man who hid behind his mother's skirts while she tried to destroy the mother of your child. I will not let my daughter grow up watching a coward pretend to be a man." I turned slightly toward the government attorney who had accompanied us downstairs. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document, handing it to me. I looked down at Julian, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, shivering and weeping. I threw the document directly in his face. It hit his chest and fluttered to the ground, landing right next to his trembling hands. "That is a federal restraining order," I stated flatly. "You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me or Maya for the rest of your natural life. If you attempt to contact us, if you so much as send an email or make a phone call, you will be arrested and charged with violating a federal mandate. You will never see my face again, Julian. You will never know your daughter. You are nothing to us." Julian stared at the restraining order on the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. He opened his mouth to beg again, but no words came out. The federal agents finally caught up to him, grabbing him roughly by the arms and hauling him off the floor. He went completely limp, letting them drag him backward toward the police cruisers. His eyes stayed locked on me, filled with a haunting, agonizing realization of exactly what he had thrown away. I did not watch him leave. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my shoes cutting through the lobby one last time. My security team flanked me as the heavy glass doors slid open, parting for me as I stepped out into the cool, dark Atlanta night. A massive armored black SUV was waiting idling at the curb. My driver opened the heavy reinforced door, and I climbed inside, settling into the soft leather seat. I cradled Maya, holding her close as the door shut heavily behind me, sealing out the chaos of the hospital, the flashing sirens, and the ghosts of the Blackwood family. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, merging onto the quiet city streets, I looked down at my sleeping child. She was breathing softly, entirely unbothered by the storm we had just navigated. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur past, and for the first time in 2 years, my mind was completely and utterly at peace. They say blood is thicker than water, but they are wrong. Blood can be toxic. Blood can be a poison that slowly drains your life, making you doubt your own sanity and your own strength. The Blackwoods believed their bloodline made them royalty. They believed their money and their heritage gave them the right to treat people like disposable pawns. They tried to break me down, to strip away my independence and turn me into a quiet, obedient shadow. But they forgot what happens when you corner someone who knows how to survive. I did not just survive them. I dismantled them. I tore their empire down to the studs and exposed the rot, hiding behind their designer suits and charity galas. True strength is not determined by the trust funds you inherit or the last name you carry. True strength is having the courage to walk away from toxic people, even when they are family, It is the power to stand in your own truth, to refuse to be silenced, and to command your own destiny. I am Aelia. I am a mother, a forensic auditor, and a woman who reclaimed her life from the ashes of betrayal. And as I hold my daughter tonight, driving toward a future that belongs entirely to us, I know with absolute certainty that the greatest revenge is not just destroying your enemies. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful, authentic life where they are no longer allowed to exist. The ultimate lesson from Aaliyah's journey is that true power does not come from vengeance, but from absolute liberation. Blood relations do not guarantee loyalty, and toxic family dynamics will drain your spirit if you allow them. True strength is found when you stop begging for validation from those who continuously hurt you and start building a life where their toxicity cannot reach you. Walking away is never a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate declaration of your self-worth. Have you ever had to bravely cut ties with toxic family members? Share your empowering stories in the comments below.